heart.
She was a wonderful mom, absolutely wonderful.
Her daughter was her everything.
Maya had like a light to her.
Until she met her fate in a dark alley.
It looked like a brutal killing. She was almost unrecognizable.
There was lots and lots of rage there.
The hunt for her killer will unveil a predator hiding in plain sight.
He was obsessive with her, and he was not going to take no for an answer.
He put her in the trunk of his car, and he tried to drive off with her.
Somebody who loves you would not hurt you like that.
That speaks to what type of monster he is.
But can investigators track him down before it's too late?
He was on the run as a fugitive.
He was dangerous. He was mentally unhinged.
This ain't over until he's in custody.
Hands up! Get him up! Reach outside, open the car door!
January 8th, 2023, Joliet, Illinois. Residents of this Chicago suburb are facing frigid temperatures following a festive holiday season.
The holidays have come and gone. The winter weather is here. So typically during this time of year for the Joliet Police Department, things are quiet.
But just after midnight, 911 dispatch receives a concerned call.
Joliet Police.
So, there has been like this car in the middle of the alleyway, and I don't know, there's nobody who kind of like come and claim it.
In Chicago, obstructed alleys are a common thing that we see.
Is anybody in the car?
No, not that I can see. There's nobody that I can see in the vehicle.
Okay. All right, we'll have someone check it out.
When they arrived on the scene, they observed the parked vehicle that was called in.
There's blood splatter all over the driver's side window, and there's a woman slumped over in the front seat.
The responding officers quickly make another tragic discovery.
Upon further investigation, they noticed that there was a child in a car seat in the rear seat of the vehicle.
Fortunately, the little girl appears to be unharmed, but they can't be certain.
She is transported to the hospital for full medical evaluation.
Meanwhile, officers attempt to identify the lifeless woman behind the wheel.
Once police run the vehicle's plates, they find out that the car is registered to 24-year-old Maya Smith.
Growing up in Joliet, Maya Smith was the apple of her mother's eye.
She was my shining light. She definitely knew how to brighten up a room. She had a very gentle spirit. She had a heart for others.
It would be real hard to find somebody who wouldn't say that Maya had like a light to her.
She always loved to sing. Singing was her thing, and she loved to dance. I would watch her when she was younger, just dance and twirl, and always, she just had this like free spirit and this laugh. Her laugh, I can hear it all the time.
She had quite the laugh. Anybody would say that. It was like the female version of Goofy. His laugh, it was like that.
But as much as Maya liked to have fun, she was serious about her faith.
She was raised in church. We often talked about God and just the spirit that she carried.
She was selfless, God-loving.
She did things with integrity. She believed in doing what was right.
After graduating high school, Maya enrolled in Joliet Junior College and also took classes at Post University.
She mentioned she wanted to be a nurse to me, and she also wanted to be a therapist. Helping other people was like something she enjoyed doing.
She always strived to look out for other people, just a great-spirited person.
And in 2017, Maya met someone special, a caring and attentive young man named Derek Scott.
When she met him, she was focusing on, school and just blossoming in life at that point.
She took her time with Derek, but Maya did eventually realized, hey, I'm in love with this man.
They seemed to have good chemistry, and they liked doing the same things, and she liked that he was laid back.
In 2019, after 2.5 years of dating Derek, Maya discovered she was pregnant.
When she got pregnant, she was in shock, but she was excited.
She always wanted children, so I was happy for her and just wanted to be supportive.
The couple's daughter was born in April of 2020.
Maya was a wonderful mom, absolutely wonderful.
Her daughter was her everything, so she just began to really, buckle down and focus on what was important.
However, the stress of parenthood began to strain Maya and Derek's relationship.
Derek and Maya were experiencing some of their hard times, some of their issues.
They were having problems being on the same page with things. They definitely had two different personalities. Ultimately, they decided to end things.
By the spring of 2022, Maya had moved on, finding comfort in a new connection with a 48-year-old barber named Jermaine Mandley.
She met Jermaine on Facebook, and they just started talking and conversing.
Jermaine was well over half of Maya's age. She was 24. He was in his late 40s.
She had never dated someone of his age, but she liked that he was more stable and older and seemed to know what he wanted. He liked to show her off. He liked to buy her nice things. She felt loved.
Maya was looking forward to what the future held for her.
She was excited about school, she was excited about family, and she was just excited about adventures that were coming next.
But now, police are shocked to find 24-year-old Maya Smith shot to death inside her vehicle.
Maya has been shot several times in her stomach and in her head.
It looked like a brutal killing. She was almost unrecognizable.
To the police, that level of violence and overkill only mean one thing.
This was definitely a crime of passion.
Jumped out to detectives as a red flag and a potential motive.
Maybe the reason why Maya was killed is because she confessed her love for Derek, and that's what really made Jermaine go over that line.
Back at the station, detectives begin digging into Jermaine's past.
When the police began to do a background search on Jermaine, they are absolutely floored by what they find. Jermaine is not your ordinary criminal.
We find out that he killed somebody years ago in a vehicle.
The incident stemmed from Jermaine being pulled over by the police. He drove off, taking the police on a chase. The chase resulted in Jermaine crashing into another vehicle and the occupants of that vehicle dying.
That vehicle was occupied by a beloved pastor and his wife, a former educator. They were following a member of their congregation home that Sunday morning.
Jermaine was found to have twice the legal limit of alcohol and drugs in his system.
In the end, Jermaine pled guilty to 2 counts of reckless homicide and was sentenced for 15 years. He was released on parole in 2014. That was just a handful of years before he met Maya Smith.
But the homicide is not Jermaine's only offense.
Based on his arrest record, he has been committing serious, dangerous crimes for decades.
Many women have come forward filing orders of protection against him for violence.
The police also learned that Jermaine had been married several times over, and one of the ex-wives stated that he was responsible for physical, mental, emotional abuse repeatedly over the course of their marriage and their relationship.
The most significant discovery in Jermaine's file is also the most recent.
Just like Derek told them, They find this domestic violence report that details the assault between Maya and Jermaine.
That occurred on June 13th of 2022.
He had roughed her up pretty well. The evidence was there.
You put it together and you say, well, this is the type of person we're dealing with.
But now, homicide detectives see from the case file that the charges were quickly dropped.
Unfortunately, she missed the court date. That's why it was not active. She went to the first one, but there was apparently a second one.
To be working, to be in school, to be taking care of your child, now you're adding on another set of issues that you have to deal with. I think that was just because she was overwhelmed, maybe scared.
She did have a small conversation with Jermaine. Like, I don't want to see you again. You hurt me. He kind of apologized in a way. Oh, I wasn't really gonna kidnap you, whatever the heck that means.
In many domestic violence cases, the offenders, they basically beg and plead and say, you know, I only did this because I love you, and please give me another chance.
Did Maya give Jermaine that second chance?
In their search for answers, detectives turn to Maya's cell phone.
After the detectives were able to finally get into Maya's cell phone, they did notice that she had Jermaine listed as a contact name, do not answer.
They also find that Maya had over 600 missed calls from him.
But the missed calls are only the beginning. Texts between Maya and Jermaine reveal even more.
There were a series of weeks leading up to the murder where there was a clear back and forth between the two of them.
About 2 weeks prior to her death on Christmas Day, she had eventually told him that she had found out who she really loves, and that was her baby's father, not Jermaine.
Maya was attempting to break up with him, attempting to leave him, telling him that she didn't think they were good together. It was very clear that she was trying to cut off ties with this person.
Jermaine tried to convince her that her baby's father didn't love her and that basically she should be with Jermaine. Even after her rejection of him, he would message her to try to get back with them, try to at least still have a sexual relationship with her. He would even say that he would pay her money to be with him.
It's clear from his text messages and the way he would interact with her that he was rather obsessive with her and that he was not going to take no for an answer.
But it's Maya's final messages with Jermaine that provide a crucial piece of the puzzle.
It appeared that Jermaine finally wore Maya down.
The last outgoing text message, the last communication from Maya was to that number for Jermaine Manley.
Maya and Jermaine were making plans to meet up on the day that she died.
Detectives investigating the shooting death of beloved 24-year-old single mother Maya Smith have just learned she was supposed to meet up with her estranged boyfriend, Jermaine Manley, on the day she died.
The last text message on Maya's phone is to Jermaine.
At this point, the investigators have no way of knowing if that meeting actually happened. But if so, it would place Jermaine with Maya at the time she was killed.
But so far, they have no way of getting in contact with Jermaine to conduct a formal interview.
While the search for Jermaine continues, detectives receive word that there's a business near the crime scene with surveillance footage from the night of the 8th.
The manager is able to pull up the surveillance video from the night of the murder for the police to look at. And what the footage shows is absolutely shocking.
The footage clearly shows Maya's car pulling into the alleyway just before 6 p.m., where it sits there for a few minutes.
Then you see the passenger turn signal come on, which I felt that was odd right away, meaning to me I felt that there might have been a struggle in the car. And during the struggle, the turn signal was hit.
Around a minute after the turn signal was activated, a male figure is seen exiting the vehicle.
It was from a distance, it was dark, so it made it harder to actually see the person.
He shoots back into the car. On camera, you see 5 muzzle flashes, but she was actually struck 8 times. So that means that there was probably shots fired in the car before he got out of the car.
And then he was seen running from the scene.
Although detectives can't make the man's face out very clearly, they believe they know exactly who they're looking at.
The man that was seen firing into the vehicle did fit very closely the physical description of Jermaine.
But where did he go after fleeing from the crime scene?
So right after he kills Maya, he runs southbound in that alley towards Ingalls Avenue, which is like a main thorough, one of the main thoroughs.
And within hours, investigators receive a tip from someone who lives on Ingalls Avenue.
This is Detective Bo.
The caller let the detectives know that on the night of the murder, Jermaine showed up at his home just minutes after the murder would have taken place.
His gut was telling him that Jermaine did something bad.
Detectives head to the home of the tipster, a man named Miles Calder.
He did say that Jermaine had arrived at his home to watch a fight that evening.
They are friends and former coworkers.
According to Miles, Jermaine showed up around 6 p.m., just minutes after the surveillance footage showed a man fleeing from the crime scene.
Miles did tell us that he saw Jermaine have a gun on him, which he said that's not abnormal.
It was a 9mm pistol, which matches the gun used to kill Maya.
Hey, man, you okay?
Yeah, I'll be all right, man.
Miles says that they have a normal night. They started drinking. They partied for the next 5-6 hours.
How long did Jermaine stay?
He was here until just past midnight. That was when the police started showing up in the alley. There were a lot of lights and sirens outside.
How did he react to that?
He said that's when Jermaine started feeling really uneasy and very out of his personality. Kept looking outside, kept washing his hands in the bathroom.
Miles felt unsettled with Jermaine's reaction, but at the time, he didn't know what had occurred in the alley.
After the stuff kind of hits social media a few hours later, and then that's when he called us.
As detectives are leaving Miles' house, they notice he has a doorbell camera.
Do you think you could bring up the video of that on your phone?
Yeah, sure.
Detectives asked if they could see the footage from that evening when Jermaine arrived.
In the videos from the doorbell, his face is basically right up to the camera. So you could clearly see it was Jermaine.
He seemed extremely nervous and agitated, and he was mumbling under his breath.
I remember watching that video for the first time saying, this guy's going through an adrenaline dump.
But it's what he says next that truly stuns investigators.
Ultimately, what he uttered from the camera is, I just killed that.
Detectives investigating the murder of 24-year-old Maya Smith have just located a damning piece of evidence against her on and off boyfriend, Jermaine Mandley.
They're able to obtain doorbell camera footage from Jermaine's friend's house that was recorded right after the murder.
Ultimately, what he uttered from the camera is, I just killed that.
It seemed very clear that this was the person who had done it.
He was probably talking to himself and had no clue that there was a camera there. And to me, that was the smoking gun in the investigation.
With the evidence piling up, on the evening of January 8th, detectives execute a search warrant on Jermaine's house.
When police show up to the house, there's no sign of Jermaine.
But the investigators find a key piece of evidence in his bedroom. They locate clothes that appear to match what the figure was wearing on the surveillance video the night of Maya's murder.
I remember specifically there was a pair of pants that looked like the ones that he was wearing the night of.
And that's not all.
They also find a necklace that appears to have dried blood on it.
However, the gun was not recovered.
And unfortunately, the investigators find no current clues about Jermaine's whereabouts.
Back at the station, detectives turn to every resource available to locate Jermaine.
At that point, we're trying to do everything in our power to get phone records, phone numbers, stuff like that, to try to track him down.
When police try to ping his cell phone, they find that it's been turned off since Sunday. And it was last seen pinging on the I-90 near the Indiana border.
Since it appears Jermaine has fled to Indiana or potentially even farther away, the detectives launch a federal fugitive task force to track Jermaine down.
This ain't over until he's in custody. So the FBI got involved.
Maya's family is left fearful and on edge after learning that Jermaine has fled.
When he was on the run, right away, I felt unsafe because he was dangerous. He was mentally unhinged. I was afraid of what would happen.
I was nervous, hoping that things went correctly, like he didn't get away, that kind of thing. Just praying that, okay, we can have some type of closure.
But just when detectives think that they're hitting a dead end, they get a call from an unexpected source.
She says she's legally married to Jermaine.
Her and Jermaine had been married for about 3 years, but she did in fact leave him last December. Because in addition to his long-standing physical abuse, she found out that Jermaine was with Maya Smith.
And it's what the woman tells detectives next that might be the answer to finally capturing Jermaine.
She was telling our detectives that Jermaine wants to meet up.
She said he's been reaching out to me.
Simone shares that Jermaine reached out to her via Snapchat using a different name, Larry Love 2023. She said that Jermaine was begging her to help him flee the police.
Simone tells police, even though she had no intention of helping him, that she was very much aware that he was wanted by the police, so she decided to play along, and she agreed to meet up with him at a casino in Hammond, Indiana.
Many of the offenders of domestic violence are so narcissistic that they really think, even though I used to beat my ex-wife, she would never, turn me in.
Now, thanks to Simone's vital tip, investigators know exactly where they can find Jermaine.
On January 10th, police set up a sting operation at the casino where Jermaine was hiding out.
So the Federal Fugitive Task Force stages themselves around the casino area, setting up a perimeter.
Basically waited for him to arrive.
At 6:30 p.m., Jermaine pulls into the casino parking lot, and police spring into action.
Get him up! Give me hands where you can see him!
On January 10th, 2023, federal investigators finally have murder suspect Jermaine Mandley in their crosshairs.
Their fugitive task force ended up locking the car, and they used flashbangs just to make sure that they don't run.
Get him up! Get out of the car! Get your hands up! Go! Hands up! Get him up! Reach outside! Open the car door!
They arrested Jermaine and took him into custody, where he was then transferred back to Joliet.
Back in Joliet, Detective Bo sits down with Jermaine.
I attempted to interview him. He invoked his rights. He did not speak about the incident. No remorse. That, to me, speaks to what type of monster he is, really.
Jermaine is booked into the Will County Jail and charged with first-degree murder.
We also charged child endangerment in addition to the murder counts because he left the baby in the car. He fired the firearm very close to her head in the car.
Maya's family and friends are finally able to find a moment of peace following Jermaine's arrest.
Him getting arrested, yeah, that was exciting. That was exciting. It was, yes, take him to court. I can't wait.
I felt good because he was off the streets and he couldn't hurt anybody else. And now we could breathe.
I was excited, just happy that he's where he needs to be.
As prosecutors prepare for trial, Maya is laid to rest.
Her funeral was beautiful. She was very popular. So many people showed up that it was like, wow, girl. She brought out almost the whole entire city.
It was an emotional day, very emotional. Her mom goes above and beyond when it comes to honoring Maya, and it's a day that will forever be with me.
It was a lot, but I did have a lot of support. It helped to have so much support.
8 months later, in August 2023, Jermaine's trial begins.
It was just surreal, being in the courtroom and him being in there. It was just such a slap in the face because he had no accountability. He didn't even say he was sorry.
He didn't show much emotion during the trial at all. I don't recall a reaction from him at all when we were discussing leaving the baby in the car or even the nature of how Maya was killed.
He just sat there like he did nothing. He just didn't care.
As the trial unfolds, the prosecution presents chilling evidence that paints a disturbing picture of Jermaine's behavior toward Maya.
The prosecutors submit evidence of the couple's text messages that paints Jermaine in the light that he was an abusive and a controlling boyfriend.
There were hundreds of text messages from him.
You could see that he was still trying to convince her to be with him, and her text messages showed that she did not want to have that type of relationship with him.
And on the night of January 7th, Jermaine's violence reached a terrifying peak.
Prosecutors argue that on January 7th that Jermaine had plans to watch a fight at his friend Mal's home. He began to harass Maya over the phone until she agreed to give him a ride. That is how they ended up in the alley.
When Maya told Jermaine she wasn't interested in seeing him anymore, he immediately snapped and shot her 8 times.
Her kid is in the back seat. You are evil. You are pure evil.
Rejection's a part of life. Everybody in this world's been rejected at some point, but some people just can't handle that.
In order to prove that Jermaine is Maya's killer, prosecutors point out the video surveillance of the crime scene and that Jermaine is in proximity at Miles' house.
Jermaine's estranged wife also takes the stand, detailing the years of abuse she suffered at his hands.
I think that we were all very impressed by her. I mean, she also, just like Maya, is a very young woman compared to Jermaine Manley. And she walked in confidently, stopped and looked at him, took the stand, and told everything that she had to tell.
After a grueling 5-day trial, the jury deliberates for just 30 minutes before rendering a verdict. Guilty.
When we got the verdict, the entire courtroom stood up and cheered before the judge was even done speaking.
Relief. I mean, we knew that was the right verdict, so we were pleased with it.
Jermaine is sentenced to life in prison.
I believe that Jermaine Manley got what he deserved. I believe a life sentence was entirely appropriate for him.
I just pray that the Lord has mercy on his soul. You know, at least I could have some sense of peace knowing that he would not be back on the street.
Those who knew Maya are left to reflect on the tragedy that could have been prevented.
Considering him having all the previous cases, he should have been locked up somewhere, a long time ago. And then Maya would have never even crossed paths with him.
I felt like he could have been stopped, but it's like he kept getting away with things. He had a track record for doing this to people. and it's like nobody's seen it.
I think a major lesson is that domestic violence doesn't get better.
I tried to tell her story to spread awareness to young women, people that I know that have been in domestic violence situations. I try to talk to them and let them know it could turn, and very quick.
Somebody who loves you would not hurt you like that. I don't care how much they do for you, they would not hurt you like that.
Nobody deserves to get beat. Nobody deserves to get strangled. Nobody deserves to get, attacked.
I would love for the world to remember her as a very nice, sweet person and somebody who cares about other people and a good mother.
She was God-loving. Remember her as God-loving. She had unconditional love for her daughter. She was kind-hearted.
Her daughter is her all over again.
After ending an almost 3-year-long relationship with the father of her child, Maya Smith found solace in an older man named Jermaine Mandley.
He seemed established and like he was looking to share his life with somebody.
They did a lot of stuff together that would kind of make you feel like it was gonna go kind of far.
But less than a year later, Joliet police have found Maya deceased in her car.
After an examination of Maya's body, they find she was shot 8 times total and 5 times in her face at point-blank range, meaning her killer was up close and personal.
Any single one of those gunshots would be enough to kill her. So the fact that the killer shot Maya that many times suggested that there was lots and lots of rage there.
This was definitely a crime of passion.
Investigators also note that the placement of Maya's body is unusual.
She was slumped over the front of the vehicle with her head on the driver's side and her legs kind of facing towards the passenger side of the vehicle.
It looks like whoever shot her wanted to make sure that the body was invisible to the oncoming eye.
Underneath Maya's body, police find multiple 9mm shell casings.
As the police collect the shell casings, they also find her cell phone, which is still locked.
All that is just invaluable evidence to us, and it could help give us a bigger picture of what actually really occurred.
While the evidence is sent to the crime lab for further processing, investigators deliver the tragic news to Maya's loved ones.
It's very difficult to go give a death notification to a family member. They had to tell the family that not only was Maya brutally murdered, but also it occurred in front of their grandchild.
They told me what happened, just that they had found her. Yeah, it was overwhelming. It was just kind of like a blur.
Fortunately, Maya's 2-year-old daughter is now safe.
She was at the hospital being cared for. She was doing well.
But investigators still need to get to the bottom of who committed this heinous crime.
It's crucial to try to put together a timeline as to how this victim got to where we're at.
Maya's mother informs the detectives that the last time she saw her daughter was yesterday afternoon.
Me and my sister were taking down my Christmas tree. Maya, she just wasn't herself that day. She just had a lot on her plate. So I just let her go out the door, and that was the last time I seen her.
It appears that this murder was incredibly personal, so it led investigators to begin to ask the family members about anybody that they knew she was dating.
They said Maya's been on and off with this guy, Jermaine Mandley, for probably a little bit over a year.
He was a little bit older, a lot bit older, in my opinion.
Obviously, being that she had a child, you are also going to want to try to talk to the father of the child.
Investigators learned Maya shared a child with Derek Scott.
Was Derek jealous of Maya's new relationship with Jermaine? Detectives decide to run a background check on him.
We end up finding that Derek Scott was incarcerated at the DuPage County Jail at the time of the homicide.
He was dealing with some unrelated charges.
While it appears on his face that Derek couldn't have done this crime because he was already in custody, police still feel it's worth having a discussion with him to try to figure out what he knows.
Myself and another detective actually drove to the DuPage County Jail and spoke with Derek.
What is this all about? It's about Maya. She's gone.
What do you mean she's gone?
I just remember the raw emotion from Derek finding out that his baby's mother was killed.
Even though they had broken up, he admits to police that he still had feelings.
I asked Derek, have you ever met Jermaine before? And I remember specifically Derek acting like he knew this guy was bad news.
Derek goes on to say that even though he's only met Jermaine once, he did not have a good feeling about him.
And he thinks this because he found out a few months ago that Jermaine viciously attacked Maya.
After 24-year-old mother Maya Smith was found shot to death in her car, her loved ones are still reeling from the tragedy.
I broke down and I was crying, and I don't know. It was hard. It was bad.
Everybody was just falling apart. We was devastated.
And her baby was in the car.
One of those bullets could have bounced off and hit the 2-year-old in the back seat. I just don't have no words for that.
Now, Illinois detectives are speaking with Maya's ex-boyfriend, Derek, who raises some concerns about her new flame, Jermaine Mandley.
He did direct him to Jermaine, who he heard did have a bit of a brutal background.
While he doesn't know all the details, he knows that Jermaine and Maya got into a heated incident back in June of 2022.
They're just sitting in the car talking. He wanted to take her somewhere, but she didn't want to go. I think it was like the middle of the night or something. And her daughter's in the house. So she's like, no, I don't want to go.
I guess he ended up arguing with her, pushing her around, shoving her around.
She tried to leave, and that's when he attacked her. And he was making threats to put her in a trunk of his car. And she was like, oh, that's not gonna happen. And she fought him, this is insane.
But eventually, Jermaine was able to overpower Maya.
He put her in the trunk of his car, and he tried to drive off with her.
I think he wanted to kidnap her, but she kicked her way out.
She was able to get out of the trunk of the car, and she ran down the street screaming for help.
Thankfully, someone heard her cries for help and called the police.
Derek tells detectives Maya was injured as a result of the attack.
I remember her lip busted, her black eye, nails missing.
And that's when they filed a police report against Jermaine for domestic battery.
But what really catches detectives' attention is Derek's last conversation with Maya.
Derek had actually spoke to Maya the day that she died.
There are cold cases that begin with a body, and then there are cold cases that begin with silence. On the night of November 18th, 1987, Jay Cook and Tanya Van Kylenborg left their home in Sonic, British Columbia, expecting to be gone only briefly. They were young. Jay was 20 years old. Tanya was 18. They were traveling together in J.S. family van, a bronze 1977 Ford Club wagon, on what should have been an ordinary overnight trip to Seattle. Their plan was simple. They were heading south to pick up a furnace part for J.S.'s father, then return home the following day. There was nothing about that journey that suggested it would become the beginning of one of the most haunting murder investigations in the Pacific Northwest. But they never came home, and when investigators finally found them, they were no longer looking for two missing young people. They were looking at two separate crime scenes, separated by miles, connected by a trail of evidence that would remain unsolved for more than 30 years. The last confirmed movements of Jay and Tanya placed them traveling through Washington state. They had crossed from Canada and continued south, eventually reaching the Bremerton area. Around 10 o'clock that night, they purchased a ticket for the ferry from Bremerton to Seattle. Then the trail went dark. No confirmed phone call. No return home. No reassuring message to family. Nothing. For the people who loved them, the silence was terrifying. At first, there was still hope that the couple had simply been delayed. Perhaps something had gone wrong with the van. Perhaps they had changed their plans. Perhaps they would appear the next morning. But morning came. Then another day, and the fear grew. The trip had been supposed to be temporary. Instead, Jay and Tanya had vanished. Investigators would eventually discover that their disappearance was not the result of an accident or a spontaneous decision to disappear. Somewhere during that journey, they had crossed paths with a killer, and that encounter would leave behind evidence that would survive for more than 3 decades. On November 24th, 6 days after the couple disappeared, Tanya's body was discovered in Skagit County, Washington. She was found partly clothed in a wooded area, and investigators immediately recognized that this was not a missing persons case anymore. It was a homicide investigation. The following day, J.S. van was found in Bellingham near the Canadian border. Inside the vehicle were clues that would become critical years later. Tanya's black pants were among the evidence recovered from the van, and forensic examination revealed semen that did not come from Jet. The biological evidence would eventually become known as the DNA profile of individual A. At the time, however, investigators had no idea whose DNA they were looking at. They had biological evidence. They had a victim. They had a missing boyfriend. They had a vehicle. But they did not have a name. Then, on November 26th, J.S.'s body was discovered in Snohomish County, more than an hour north of Seattle. His body had been found near a river, and investigators were now confronted with a brutal reality. 2 young people had left Canada together, and within days, both were dead in Washington state. Their bodies had been discovered in different locations, while the van was found somewhere else. Evidence was scattered across the region. What investigators were facing was not one simple crime scene. It was a chain of locations that had to be connected. The case immediately became one of the most disturbing investigations in the region. Detective Jim Scharf would later describe it as one of the most horrendous, unsolved cases his department had ever faced. Investigators had reason to believe that the same offender had been responsible for the violence against both victims, but proving exactly what had happened was extraordinarily difficult. A bullet casing discovered near Tanya's body was connected to bullets collected at a tavern in Bellingham, although the weapon itself was never found. A surgical glove was discovered under a port. Investigators believe the glove may have been used to avoid leaving fingerprints. And then there were plastic zip ties. They appeared in different locations connected to the case, including near the bodies and inside the van. Those small pieces of plastic would become one of the clues prosecutors later used to argue that the separate scenes were connected. But in 1987, none of those pieces could produce the name investigators desperately needed. The most important clue may have been sitting quietly inside the van. Tanya's pants contained biological evidence. Scientists determined that the semen found on them did not come from Jed, and the DNA profile matched biological evidence recovered from Tanya's body. Investigators now had a genetic signature belonging to an unknown man. They called him Individual A. That name would follow the case for decades. Individual A was not a face. He was not a suspect. He was not someone detectives could knock on a door and question. He was simply a biological profile extracted from evidence connected to a murder. In 1987, that distinction was enormous. Modern forensic genealogy did not exist in the form investigators would eventually use. Consumer DNA databases were decades away. the technology needed to turn distant genetic relatives into a family tree and then into a suspect did not yet exist. The investigators could preserve the evidence, but they could not force it to reveal its own. And so the investigation began its long journey into darkness. Leads came and went. Investigators examined possible suspects. People were questioned. The case attracted attention, but the killer remained unidentified. The families were left with questions that had no answers. Why had Jay and Tanya been targeted? Who had approached them? How had the killer gained control of the situation? Where had the couple first encountered him? How had their final hours unfolded? Every unanswered question became another piece of the burden carried by those who survived them. Then came another disturbing development. In the months after the murders, the victims' families received taunting greeting cards containing graphic descriptions of the killing. The cards were postmarked from different cities, including Seattle, Los Angeles, and New York, and they appeared to have been written by the same person. For years, the cards added another layer of horror to an already terrifying case. Investigators eventually identified the person responsible for sending them in 2010, but authorities determined that he was not the killer and had no connection to the murder. The letters were therefore another dead end, another disturbing chapter that failed to reveal the identity of individual A. The years continued. The 80s became the 90s. The 90s became the 2000s. The 2000s became the 2010s. The photographs of Jay and Tanya grew older while the unanswered question remained exactly where it had always been. Who killed them? The case was not forgotten by investigators. Evidence remained stored. DNA remained available, but there was still no match. No database produced the identity. No witness suddenly appeared with the missing piece. The killer seemed to have vanished into ordinary lives. Somewhere, investigators believed the person whose DNA had been recovered from the crime scene had continued living. He had grown older. He had changed. He had built a life. Perhaps he had married. Perhaps he had children. Perhaps he had gone to work every morning, paid bills, driven through the same streets as everyone else. And all the while, somewhere inside an evidence archive, his genetic signature remained connected to 2 murders. The most frightening part was that investigators did not know where he was. They knew what his DNA looked like. They did not know his name. They knew evidence from the crime scene belonged to him. They did not know his address. They had a biological identity without a human identity. Then technology began to change the rule. The same scientific revolution that would help investigators solve other famous cold cases created a possibility that had not existed when Jay and Tanya disappeared. Genetic genealogy could potentially take unknown crime scene DNA and compare it with relatives who had voluntarily uploaded their genetic information to genealogy databases. Instead of searching directly for the killer, investigators could search for his family, a cousin, a second cousin, a distant relative, someone who had no idea that their DNA might one day become part of a murder investigation. It was a radical idea, and it would eventually transform the Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg case. In 2018, after more than 30 years of unanswered questions, Detective Jim Scharf saw reports about the use of genetic genealogy in another notorious cold case. The breakthrough suggested that individual A might no longer be untouchable. Scharf contacted Parabon Nanolabs, a company working with investigators on advanced DNA analysis. Genetic genealogist Cease Moore became involved. The DNA recovered from Tanya's pants was developed into a genetic profile and uploaded to GEDmatch for genealogical analysis. The question was no longer simply whether the killer's DNA matched a known criminal. The question had become far more ambitious. Could the DNA lead investigators to the killer's relatives, and could those relatives lead investigators to him? For 31 years, Individual A had been nothing more than a name created by investigators for an unknown man. Now, for the first time, his DNA could be placed inside a family tree. Somewhere among thousands of genetic connections was a path leading back toward the man investigators had been searching for since 1987. And when Cease Moore began following those connections, the case that had seemed frozen in time was about to move faster than anyone could have imagined. The killer had spent more than 3 decades hiding behind the absence of a name, but DNA had never forgotten him. And now, for the first time, the evidence was beginning to point toward a family, a place, and eventually, one man. For 31 years, investigators had been staring at the same invisible face. They knew the killer had left something behind. They knew that biological evidence recovered from Tanya Van Keelenborg's clothing and body belonged to the same unknown man. They had a genetic profile. What they did not have was the one piece of information that could turn science into an arrest: a name. In ordinary DNA investigations, detectives often compare crime scene DNA against databases containing profiles from known offenders. If the unknown profile matches someone already in the system, the investigation can move quickly. But what happens when the person has never been arrested, never submitted DNA, and never appeared in a criminal database? For the Jay Cook and Tanya Van Keelenborg investigation, that was exactly the problem. Individual A was invisible to the traditional system. The killer's DNA existed, but the killer's identity did not. Then genetic genealogy changed the equation. The technique did not require investigators to find the killer directly. Instead, it offered a completely different path. If the unknown DNA profile could be compared with genetic information voluntarily uploaded by members of genealogy databases, investigators might discover relatives of the unknown man. Those relatives might lead to parents, grandparents, siblings, cousins, and eventually a family tree. And somewhere inside that tree could be the person investigators had been hunting since 1987. It sounded almost impossible, but by 2018, investigators had already seen genetic genealogy transform other cold cases. Detective Jim Scharf of the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office had followed those developments closely. After seeing the technique used to identify suspects in other investigations, he realized that the old evidence from the Cook and Van Keelenborg case might finally have a new purpose. The biological evidence had survived. The science had changed. The case could be reopened from an entirely different direction. Scharf contacted Parabon Nanolabs, a company involved in forensic genetic genealogy, and the investigation entered a new phase. Cease Moore, a genetic genealogist working with Parabon, became one of the key figures in the effort. Her task was unlike that of a traditional detective. She was not starting with a witness who remembered a face. She was not starting with a license plate or a phone record. She was starting with genetic relationships. The unknown DNA profile was examined for connections to people who had submitted their own DNA to a public genealogy database. The objective was not to find the killer immediately. It was to find the killer's relatives. That distinction would become critical. A distant cousin could be living thousands of miles away and have absolutely no idea that their genetic information was connected to a murder investigation. Yet that distant cousin could provide the first branch of a family tree that ultimately led to the suspect. Investigators were entering territory where criminal investigation and genealogy had never intersected on this scale before. The evidence was no longer simply a forensic sample. It was a map of biological relationship. Moore began working through the genetic matching. She examined shared DNA segments, estimated relationships, constructed family trees, and searched historical records. The process was painstaking. A genetic match alone was not enough. The relative had to be placed correctly within a larger family structure. The family tree had to make sense across generations. Names, dates, marriages, births, locations, and relationships all had to align. One incorrect assumption could send the investigation down the wrong branch. One distant relative could open a door, but investigators still had to determine which door mattered. As Moore worked through the available genetic connections, the mystery began to shrink. The unknown killer was no longer simply individual A. His biological relatives were beginning to appear. The investigation had moved from a question about identity to a question about ancestry. Who were the parents of the unknown man? Where had they lived? Who were their children? Which descendants had been in Washington state in 1987? Which male relatives could have been old enough to commit the crimes? Which family lines intersected with the geography of the investigation? Each question narrowed the possibilities. This was not the kind of breakthrough that happened in a single dramatic moment. It was a slow process of elimination. The family tree grew branch by branch, and eventually one branch began to stand out. Moore identified a family connection that led investigators toward the Talbot family. The name that eventually emerged was William Earl Talbot I. He was not a random stranger who had appeared from nowhere. He was a man whose family history could be traced through the genetic relationships identified in the investigation. The genealogy did not immediately prove that Talbot was the killer. It gave investigators something they had never possessed before: a specific person whose biological family appeared connected to the unknown DNA profile. That was enough to change the investigation completely. Detectives now had to move carefully. Genetic genealogy could identify a potential family line, but investigators still needed direct evidence connecting the suspect himself to the crime scene. The next step was therefore classic police work. Investigators needed a DNA sample from Talbot, but they could not simply announce that they had found him and demand that he cooperate. They needed to build the case methodically. Talbot lived in Washington State. Detectives began watching him. They observed his movements and searched for an opportunity to obtain discarded DNA. The investigation had reached the stage where the suspect was no longer an unknown figure buried somewhere inside a massive family tree. He was a real person. He had an address. He had a daily routine. He had a life that had continued for 31 years, and investigators now had reason to believe that his DNA might match the biological evidence preserved from the murders. The surveillance had to be precise. If investigators were going to use a discarded item to obtain DNA, they needed to ensure that the material came from Talbot himself. Eventually, detectives obtained a discarded coffee cup from him. The cup was sent for DNA testing. The laboratory comparison would determine whether the genetic genealogy theory was correct. The result was extraordinary. The DNA recovered from the coffee cup matched the DNA profile of individual A. The man whose identity had been unknown for more than 3 decades was now directly connected to the biological evidence from the murder. William Earl Talbot had been identified through a combination of genealogy, investigative work, and forensic DNA analysis. The cold case had finally reached a turning point, but investigators were not finished. A DNA match can be powerful, but a murder investigation must still establish the circumstances surrounding the crime. Detectives needed to understand who Talbot was in 1987, where he had been, how he could have encountered Jay and Tanya, and whether the evidence supported the conclusion that he was responsible for their death. The genetic genealogy had given them the suspect. The direct DNA comparison gave them a forensic connection. Now the investigation had to reconstruct the past. That meant returning to the original evidence: the van, the clothing, the locations where Jay and Tanya were found, the plastic ties, the bullet evidence, the surgical glove. Every surviving detail had to be examined again. The investigators were no longer searching through darknet. They were looking at the case with a specific suspect in mind. And that changed everything. Evidence that had once been merely mysterious could now be evaluated in context. Investigators could ask whether Talbot's known history and movements were consistent with the physical evidence. They could examine whether his family connections fit the genealogy. They could determine whether the DNA evidence was consistent with the original crime scenes. The case was beginning to form a coherent structure after 31 years of fragments. Yet one of the most disturbing aspects of the investigation was the sheer amount of time that had passed. Talbot had lived for decades while the families of Jay and Tanya continued to carry the consequences of the murder. He had reached adulthood after the killings. He had built a life. He had remained outside the reach of the original investigation. If investigators were correct, the man whose DNA had been preserved from the crime scene had spent more than 3 decades moving through the world without being identified. That possibility was chilling. It demonstrated the limitations of traditional databases. A person does not have to be invisible to everyone. He only has to be invisible to the system searching for him. In 1987, the system had no path to Talbot. In 2018, genealogy created one, and that was the revolutionary element of the case. Investigators had not found Talbot because his name appeared in an old police file. They found him because his DNA had relatives. The killer's genetic identity had been hiding inside a family network. The investigation simply needed the technology and expertise to trace that network backward. For Cece Moore, the case represented one of the most striking examples of what forensic genealogy could accomplish. For detectives, it was the first real opportunity in decades to bring the investigation toward an identifiable suspect. For the families, it meant that the question that had haunted them since 1987 finally had a possible answer. But there was still another question, one that could only be answered through the courts and through evidence gathered directly from Talbot himself. Was William Earl Talbot truly the man whose DNA had been recovered from the crime scene? The discarded coffee cup provided the critical comparison. The laboratory found that it matched. Individual A was no longer anonymous. The name was William Earl Talbot. And suddenly, the cold case that had survived 31 years was no longer a mystery without a suspect. It had become an active homicide investigation again. Detectives had a person. They had a DNA match. They had a reconstructed family connection, and they had two victims whose families had waited more than 3 decades for someone to answer the question that had never gone away. Who killed Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg? The investigation was finally close to answering it. But before the final conclusion could be reached, detectives would have to confront the most difficult part of any cold case, proving that the DNA match was not merely a scientific coincidence, but the beginning of a complete evidentiary chain connecting one man to 2 murders committed more than 30 years earlier. For 31 years, the killer had existed in the investigation as a biological profile, nothing more. Investigators knew that DNA from the crime scene belonged to a man. They could compare it, they could preserve it, they could describe it, but they could not attach a name to it. Then, in 2018, the investigation crossed a boundary that had barely existed a few years earlier. Genetic genealogy transformed the unknown DNA from a dead end into a family map. The evidence was uploaded to GEDmatch, a public genetic genealogy website, and promising matches appeared for relatives of the unknown suspect. From those connections, genealogists began reconstructing a family tree. The breakthrough did not happen with one dramatic flash of recognition. It happened through painstaking research. A distant genetic connection could mean almost anything. It might lead to hundreds of people. It might belong to a branch of a family that had no connection to the murders. Investigators had to work backward through generations, matching genetic relationships with names, dates, locations, marriages, births, and family history. Somewhere in that enormous network was the person whose DNA had been left behind in 1987. The challenge was finding him, and slowly, the branches began narrowing. The genealogy pointed investigators toward the Talbot family. Eventually, the name William Earl Talbot I emerged as the possible source of the unknown DNA. But a genealogical lead was not enough. It was a direction, not a verdict. Detectives now had to take the extraordinary information produced by genealogy and turn it into traditional forensic evidence. They needed Talbot's DNA. They needed a direct comparison. They needed to know whether the man identified through a family tree was actually the man whose biological material had been recovered from the crime scene more than 3 decades earlier. That meant surveillance. Investigators began following Talbot. They knew he was a real person living in Washington state. He was no longer a distant genetic possibility buried inside a database. He was a man moving through an ordinary modern life, unaware that detectives were attempting to connect him to 2 murders committed when he was a young man. The contrast was extraordinary. In 1987, Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg had disappeared during a trip through Washington. In 2018, the person investigators believed had been connected to their deaths was living in the same state, more than 30 years older. The case had crossed from history back into the present. Investigators eventually obtained an abandoned coffee cup that Talbot had used. The Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory tested the DNA recovered from the cup. The result was decisive. The DNA positively matched the profile developed from evidence collected during the original investigation. The man hidden inside the genealogy had been identified. On May 17, 2018, William Earl Talbot I was arrested in Seattle. He was 55 years old. More than 30 years had passed since Jay and Tanya were killed. Authorities initially arrested him on a first-degree murder warrant related to Tanya's death, while investigators continued gathering evidence concerning Jay's murder. The arrest was historic. It was described by the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office as the first arrest of a murder suspect resulting from Parabon Nanolab's genetic genealogy service, and it became one of the landmark early cases demonstrating the power of forensic genetic genealogy. But for investigators, the arrest was not the end. It was the beginning of the most important phase of the case. For 31 years, they had been asking who killed Jay and Tanya. Now they had a suspect. The question changed. Could they prove what happened? The original evidence suddenly mattered in a different way. Investigators returned to the details of the crime scene. Tanya's body had been discovered on November 24th in a wooded area of Skagit County. Jay's body had been found 2 days later in Snohomish County. Their van had been discovered abandoned in Bellingham. The geography of the crime was spread across multiple counties, creating a complicated investigative picture from the beginning. Tanya's murder involved evidence of sexual assault, and the biological evidence became one of the most important links in the case. Jay had been beaten and strangled. Investigators now had to determine how the physical evidence connected these separate acts to the same offender. The old evidence also included objects whose significance had never been fully resolved. A light blue blanket was found wrapped around Jay's body. His family had never seen it before. Tanya's 35mm Minolta camera was missing. Its lens was later recovered and traced to a pawn shop in Portland, Oregon in 1990, while the camera body remained missing. Detectives also sought information about the van and the blanket after Talbot's arrest. Every one of those details mattered because investigators were no longer searching for an unknown offender. They were reconstructing the movements of a specific man. The question was no longer simply, who could have done this? It became, what evidence connects this particular man to what happened? That distinction would become central when the case reached court. Talbot was not merely identified through genealogy. His DNA was directly matched to the crime scene evidence, but prosecutors still had to establish the rest of the case beyond the genetic connection. They needed to present the evidence in a way that allowed a jury to understand what had happened more than 3 decades earlier. They had to reconstruct the journey of Jay and Tanya from Canada into Washington. They had to explain the sequence of discoveries. They had to show how the DNA evidence had survived. And they had to demonstrate how a suspect identified in 2018 could be connected to murders committed in 1987. The passage of time was both the greatest obstacle and one of the most powerful elements of the prosecution's case. 31 years had passed, but the DNA had not changed. The biological evidence collected in 1987 could still be compared with a modern sample. The result was the same. The unknown profile and Talbot's DNA matched. The science had crossed the decades. Yet there was still a human problem. Memories fade. Witnesses move away. People die. Records disappear. The prosecution had to rely heavily on evidence that could survive time. The DNA was therefore not simply another clue. It was the bridge connecting 2 completely different eras of the investigation. In 1987, investigators had a murder scene without a name. In 2018, they had a name whose DNA matched the old evidence. That bridge was what made prosecution possible. As the case developed, the public began to understand just how revolutionary the investigative method had been. Traditional forensic databases had failed to identify the unknown DNA because the killer's profile did not match a known offender. Genetic genealogy changed the search. Instead of looking for the exact person, investigators looked for biological relatives. Those relatives became signposts. Their DNA did not identify the suspect directly, but it provided the family structure needed to find him. It was a completely different investigative philosophy. The killer had not necessarily entered a law enforcement database, but someone related to him had entered a genealogy database. That was enough to create a path. The implications were enormous. For decades, investigators had been searching for a person. Genetic genealogy allowed them to search for a family. Once the family was identified, traditional police work could take over. Detectives could investigate the people connected to the family tree. They could establish ages. They could examine locations. They could determine who was living in the relevant region in 1987. They could eliminate individuals who could not have been involved. Eventually, one person remained at the center of the investigation: William Earl Talbot, I. The genetic genealogy did not end the case. It gave the detectives the doorway. The direct DNA comparison opened it. The arrest brought the suspect into the legal system. Now the evidence would have to survive another test, one far different from a laboratory examination. It would have to survive a courtroom, and that meant every detail of the investigation could be challenged. The defense could question how the genealogy had been conducted. It could challenge the collection and interpretation of evidence. It could question the circumstances surrounding the DNA sample. It could dispute the prosecution's reconstruction of the murder. The state would have to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. The technology that had identified Talbot was extraordinary, but technology alone could not determine guilt. That decision belonged to the justice system, and as the case moved toward trial, investigators were forced to revisit the terrible events of November 1987 with an intensity they had not experienced in decades. The old photographs were still there. The old reports were still there. The evidence was still there. But now, for the first time, every piece had to be understood in relation to the man sitting at the center of the investigation. The case that had once been defined by uncertainty was becoming a prosecution. The families of Jay and Tanya had waited more than 30 years for this moment. But even after the arrest, one question remained hanging over everything. Would the evidence that had finally found William Earl Talbot be strong enough to convince a jury that he was responsible for the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg? The answer would come not from a genealogy database, not from a computer search, and not from a single DNA report, but inside a courtroom where 3 decades of evidence would finally be placed before a jury. The arrest of William Earl Talbot. I changed everything, but it did not erasing investigators. For 31 years, they had been trying to identify the man behind the DNA profile known as individual. Now they had a name, a face, and a direct genetic match. But an arrest is not a conclusion. It is a demand for proof, and the prosecution would have to convince a jury that the man identified through genetic genealogy was not merely related to the unknown DNA profile, but was the individual whose biological evidence had been recovered from the murder investigation. The challenge was enormous because the crimes had occurred in 1987. Memories were decades old. Physical locations had changed. People had aged. Some witnesses were no longer available. Yet the evidence collected in those first days had survived, and that evidence was about to become the foundation of one of the most closely watched forensic prosecutions in Washington state. The story began with a journey that had taken Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg from British Columbia into Washington. They had crossed the border in J.S. family van, a 1977 Ford Club wagon. Their trip was supposed to be temporary. They planned to travel to Seattle to obtain a furnace part for J.S. father. Instead, they disappeared. Their last known movements would eventually become a crucial part of the investigation. On November 18, 1987, the couple purchased a ferry ticket in Bremerton for the crossing to Seattle. After that, their movements became uncertain. 6 days later, Tanya's body was found in Skagit County. The following day, J.S. van was discovered in Bellingham. Then, on November 26th, J.S. body was found in Snohomish County. 3 locations, 2 victims. 1, abandoned vehicle. A trail of evidence spread across Washington. For investigators, the geography itself created questions. Why were the victims found in different places? Where had the van been driven? Where had the attack occurred? How had the killer moved between the locations? And most importantly, where had Jay and Tanya first encountered the person who would ultimately take their lives? Some of those questions could never be answered completely, but the physical evidence could still establish connection. Tanya's clothing contained semen that did not belong to Jay. That biological material produced the DNA profile that investigators would eventually call individual A. The same DNA profile was also associated with evidence collected from Tanya's body. That was the forensic thread that survived the decades. It had been there since the beginning, waiting for technology to make it useful. Investigators also recovered other physical evidence from locations connected to the murder. Plastic zip ties were found in connection with the crime scenes, and a surgical glove was discovered under a port. A bullet casing found near Tanya's body was associated with other ammunition recovered from a tavern in Bellingham. The firearm itself was never recovered. These clues did not individually identify the killer, but together they formed part of the investigative picture. There were also objects whose origins remained mysterious. A light blue blanket was found wrapped around Jay's body. His family did not recognize it. Tanya's Minolta camera was missing, and its lens was eventually traced to a pawn shop in Portland, Oregon in 1990. The camera body itself was never recovered. Each item raised another question. Each unanswered question became another piece of the mystery that investigators carried for decades. Then the genetic genealogy breakthrough arrived. Cease Moore and investigators working with Parabon Nanolabs had used the unknown DNA profile to identify distant relatives through genealogical databases. The resulting family tree led them toward William Earl Talbot I. But investigators still needed direct confirmation. That confirmation came from the discarded coffee cup. DNA recovered from the cup matched the unknown profile from the original investigation. Suddenly, the biological evidence collected in 1987 and the man identified in 2018 were connected. The science had crossed 31 years, but prosecutors knew that a jury would need to understand what that match meant. The defense would have the opportunity to challenge the evidence. The prosecution therefore had to present not simply a DNA result, but a chain of reasoning supported by multiple pieces of evidence. Talbot's arrest was only the beginning. As detectives continued investigating, they revisited the original case files and physical evidence. They looked again at the timeline. They examined the victims' movements. They reviewed the locations where their bodies had been found. They considered the evidence recovered from the van. They examined the biological material that had survived since 1987, and they reconstructed the genetic genealogy investigation that had led to Talbot. The story was extraordinary enough that it quickly attracted national attention. Genetic genealogy had already begun changing the landscape of cold case investigations, but the Cook and Van Cuylenborg case was particularly significant because it showed how a technique normally associated with tracing ancestry could be transformed into a tool for homicide investigation. Instead of searching directly for a criminal profile in a law enforcement database, investigators had followed the unknown man's biological relatives. The path eventually led to Talbot. That method would later become famous across the United States, but in 2018, it was still relatively new and controversial. The prosecution therefore had to explain the science clearly. A genealogical match did not mean that a distant relative was automatically guilty. The family tree was a lead. Investigators then obtained a direct DNA sample from the person identified by that lead. The laboratory comparison provided the critical confirmation. Talbot's DNA matched the crime scene profile. That distinction mattered. The genealogy pointed investigators toward him. The direct DNA testing connected him to the biological evidence. The two processes supported each other, yet the defense could still argue that a DNA match alone did not explain the entire crime. The prosecution had to establish how the biological evidence fit into the broader circumstances. This was where the original investigation became essential. The evidence had not been created in 2018. It had been collected in 1987, long before Talbot was identified. That meant investigators could not simply argue that the evidence had been gathered because police suspected him. It had been collected before anyone knew his name. The biological evidence existed independently of Talbot's later identification. That fact gave it enormous significance. The DNA had not been manufactured to fit a suspect. The suspect had been found because of the DNA. This reversed the usual perception of a criminal investigation. Instead of investigators selecting a suspect and then searching for evidence, the evidence had effectively selected the suspect. The genetic profile existed first. The genealogy pointed toward a family. The direct sample then pointed toward Talbot. That chain would become one of the most powerful elements of the case. But prosecutors still had to confront the passage of time. More than 30 years separated the murders from the trial. The defense could emphasize that gap. Witness memories might have changed. Some physical locations might no longer look the same. The investigation had evolved through several generations of detectives. The original case had been investigated under technologies that were dramatically different from those available in 2018, yet the core biological evidence remained unchanged. DNA does not depend on memory. It does not become confused because 30 years have passed. The sample recovered from the original crime scene could still be compared with Talbot's DNA. The result was the same. The profile matched. That scientific continuity was extraordinary. The victims had aged only in photographs. The investigators had grown old. The suspect had become a middle-aged man. But the DNA profile remained exactly where it had been since the night of the murders. It was as though the evidence had been waiting in silence for the world to catch up. And now that it had, prosecutors had to make the jury understand what that meant. They would present the case as a story that began with two young people traveling from Canada and ended with a genetic trail leading investigators to a Washington man more than 3 decades later. The prosecution would argue that the DNA was not an isolated coincidence. It was part of a larger body of evidence connecting Talbot to the crime. The defense, meanwhile, would have the opportunity to challenge the state's interpretation. That adversarial process was essential because forensic science, no matter how powerful, still had to be examined in court. The jury would have to decide whether the evidence proved guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. For the families of Jay and Tanya, the legal proceedings represented something they had waited decades to see. For most of their lives since 1987, the murders had remained an open wound without an identified offender. Now someone was finally sitting in court facing charges connected to the death. But even as the prosecution prepared its case, the central mystery remained brutally simple. What happened to Jay and Tanya after they disappeared from the ferry terminal? The evidence could tell investigators that the unknown DNA belonged to Talbot. It could establish a connection between him and Tanya, but the jury would need to hear the entire story. The prosecution would have to reconstruct the final journey of two young people whose ordinary trip became a nightmare. And as the evidence was laid out, the courtroom would confront the same question investigators had faced since 1987. Could the surviving fragments of a 31-year-old crime finally tell a complete enough story to deliver justice? For more than 3 decades, the names Jay Cook and Tanya Van Kuylenborg had remained attached to an investigation without a defendant standing before a court. That changed when William Earl Talbot was arrested in 2018. Suddenly, the case that had spent years gathering dust in investigative files was alive again. Detectives were no longer simply asking who had left DNA behind. Prosecutors were preparing to argue that the man identified through that DNA was responsible for the deaths of 2 young people whose families had waited 31 years for answers. The courtroom would become the place where the old evidence and the new science collided. At the center of the prosecution's case was a fact that was difficult to ignore. The DNA profile recovered from the original investigation matched Talbot's DNA. The biological evidence had existed decades before investigators knew his name. That meant the identification had not begun with a suspect and worked back. It had begun with evidence and moved forward toward a suspect. That distinction would become one of the defining features of the case. The prosecution's challenge was to connect the scientific result with the events of November 1987 and convince jurors that the evidence formed a coherent story of murder. The defense, meanwhile, had to confront the reality that Talbot's genetic profile had been linked directly to evidence from the investigation. The legal battle would not simply be about whether DNA was present. It would be about what that DNA meant in the context of the entire case. The first task for the prosecution was to take the jury back more than 30 years, to a time when Jay and Tanya were still alive and their journey had not yet become a murder investigation. Jay was 20 years old. Tanya was 18. They were young, close, and traveling together in a van belonging to Jay's family. Their trip from British Columbia into Washington had an ordinary purpose. They were going to obtain a furnace part for Jay's father. Nothing about the plan suggested that they would never return. Yet within days, both would be dead. Their final confirmed movements became part of the chronology prosecutors needed to reconstruct. They had traveled through Washington and reached the Bremerton area. Around 10 o'clock on the night of November 18th, they purchased a ticket for the ferry to Seattle. After that, certainty disappeared. Investigators would later have to reconstruct the final hours from physical evidence and surviving records rather than from the victims themselves. 6 days after their disappearance, Tanya's body was discovered in Skagit County. The following day, J.S. van was found in Bellingham. Then, on November 26th, J.S. body was discovered in Snohomish County. The locations created a disturbing geographic trail. The couple had disappeared together, but their bodies were found separately. The van had been abandoned somewhere else. The investigation, therefore, had to determine how those locations were connected. The biological evidence provided one of the strongest links. Semen recovered from Tanya's clothing produced the DNA profile that investigators later identified as Individual A. The same profile was associated with evidence from Tanya's body. That evidence had been collected before anyone knew who Individual A was decades later. It matched Talbot. The prosecution could therefore tell the jury that the DNA was not merely a modern discovery, it was part of the original investigation. It had been sitting inside the case for 31 years. The question was why it had taken so long to identify its source. The answer was technology. In 1987, investigators did not have the modern tools necessary to identify the unknown DNA through genetic genealogy. Even after DNA profiling became available, a profile without a corresponding person in a database could remain unidentified indefinitely. Individual A was effectively a biological ghost. Investigators knew the DNA belonged to a man, but they did not know where he was. Traditional database searches could not provide the missing identity. Genetic genealogy changed that. Instead of searching for the exact individual, investigators searched for relative. Cease Moore and Parabon Nanolabs used the unknown profile to locate genetic connections through GEDmatch. The family tree eventually led to Talbot. Investigators then obtained his discarded coffee cup and compared his DNA with the old profile. The match transformed the genealogy investigation into direct forensic evidence. The prosecution now had a method for explaining the case from beginning to end. The original crime scene produced the DNA. The genealogy produced a family. The family tree produced Talbot. The discarded coffee cup produced the direct DNA match, and the historical evidence established that the biological profile was connected to the murder. But the courtroom would demand more than a scientific chain. Prosecutors also had to establish the circumstances of the killings. Evidence indicated that Tanya had been sexually assaulted. Jay had suffered fatal violence. The two victims had been separated and their bodies left in different locations. Investigators had recovered physical objects associated with the crime, including plastic zip ties and other items whose significance had been examined over the years. A bullet casing near Tanya's body was connected to ammunition found at a Bellingham tavern, although the firearm itself was never recovered. A surgical glove was also discovered under a porch. These pieces did not all lead directly to Talbot, but they helped reconstruct the violent circumstances surrounding the murders. The defense had its own task. A case involving evidence more than 30 years old was inherently vulnerable to questions about memory, interpretation, and reconstruction. The defense could challenge the investigation's assumption. It could question how the evidence had been handled. It could examine the genealogy process and the way investigators had moved from distant relatives to Talbot. It could argue that the jury needed to distinguish between what the DNA proved and what prosecutors inferred from it. That distinction was crucial. DNA can establish a biological connection. It does not automatically provide a complete narrative of a murder. A jury must consider the circumstances surrounding the evidence. Where was it found? How did it get there? What other evidence supports the prosecution's theory? What alternative explanations exist? The trial, therefore, became a test not only of forensic science, but of the entire investigative chain. The prosecution needed to show that the pieces fit together. The defense needed to show whether reasonable doubt remained. For the families, the proceedings carried a different meaning. They had spent decades watching the case remain unresolved. They had seen investigators come and go. They had lived with the knowledge that whoever killed Jay and Tanya had never been publicly identified. Now there was finally a defendant, the name William Earl Talbot. I was no longer simply the conclusion of a genealogy investigation. It was attached to formal criminal charges. The courtroom offered something the families had not seen in 31 years. The possibility of legal accountability. But the case also forced everyone back into the details of the murder. The evidence had been preserved, but so had the memory of what had happened. Every photograph, every report, every piece of testimony brought the victims back into the center of the investigation. They were no longer simply names in an old, cold case. They were young people whose final journey was being reconstructed before a jury. And the deeper the trial went, the more remarkable the forensic timeline became. In 1987, investigators had an unidentified DNA profile. In 2018, genetic genealogy connected that profile to a family. A discarded coffee cup provided the direct match. More than 3 decades after the murders, prosecutors were now presenting the result to jurors. The technology had solved the identification problem, but the legal system still had to decide responsibility. This was the moment the entire investigation had been moving toward. The old evidence was no longer hidden inside an archive. It was being examined in public. Scientists could explain the DNA. Detectives could explain the investigation. Prosecutors could reconstruct the timeline. The defense could challenge the conclusions. And 12 people would eventually have to weigh everything they heard. The stakes were enormous because the case was about more than one suspect. It was about whether two murders that had haunted investigators since 1987 could finally receive a judicial conclusion. The courtroom was effectively reopening a door that had been closed for decades. Behind that door were the last days of Jay and Tanya, the abandoned van, the separate crime scenes, the biological evidence, and the unknown man whose DNA had remained unidentified for 31 years. Now that man had a name, he had been arrested, and he was sitting at the center of a trial that could finally answer the question that had haunted two families and an entire investigative team for generations. But the prosecution still had to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. The DNA had brought Talbot into the courtroom. The remaining evidence would determine whether he would leave it as a convicted murderer. And as jurors began hearing the story of what happened in Washington in 1987, one reality became impossible to escape. The cold case had finally reached the moment when science would have to meet justice. For the families of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Kalenborg, the courtroom represented something that had seemed impossible for most of their adult lives. The possibility that the man identified through DNA would finally be held legally responsible for what happened in 1987. William Earl Talbot. I had been arrested in May 2018 after investigators used genetic genealogy to trace the unknown DNA profile to his family and then obtained a direct DNA sample from a discarded coffee cup. The laboratory confirmed the match. After 31 years, the biological evidence had finally acquired a name, but now the evidence had to survive a completely different test. It had to survive a trial. The prosecution had to take the jury back to a cold November night more than 3 decades earlier and reconstruct a journey that had begun with 2 young people leaving British Columbia and ended with both of them dead in Washington state. The facts were stark. Jay Cook and Tanya Van Kalenborg had crossed from Victoria to Port Angeles on November 18, 1987. They were traveling in Jay's family's bronze 1977 Ford Club wagon, planning to pick up a furnace part in Seattle and return to Canada the next day. Their last known location was the Bremerton area, where they purchased a ticket for the Seattle ferry at 10:16 that night. After that, the trail disappeared. They were reported missing. Then came the discoveries that transformed the missing persons investigation into a double homicide investigation. Tanya's body was found on November 24th in a wooded area off Parsons Creek Road in Skagit County. J.S. Van was found the following day, locked and abandoned in Bellingham. On November 26th, J.S. body was discovered near the Snoqualmie River in Snohomish County. 3 locations, 2 victims. One investigation that would eventually span generations of detectives. The prosecution's case was built around evidence that had been collected long before anyone knew Talbot's name. That was critical. The DNA did not appear after investigators chose Talbot as a suspect. It existed from the beginning. Biological evidence recovered from Tanya's clothing and body produced a male DNA profile. Investigators searched traditional law enforcement databases for years, but no match appeared. The unknown profile remained what detectives called Individual A. Then, genetic genealogy changed the search. Investigators provided the DNA data to Parabon Nanolabs, whose genealogists used GEDmatch to identify promising genetic connections to relatives of the unknown man. Those connections were used to construct a family tree. Eventually, the investigation led to William Earl Talbot I. Police then obtained a discarded coffee cup that Talbot had used. The Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory confirmed that the DNA from the cup positively matched the crime scene profile. That scientific sequence became one of the most extraordinary aspects of the prosecution. The investigators had not started with Talbot and then searched for evidence to connect him to the crime. They had started with evidence from the crime and followed it toward Talbot. 31 years separated the original sample from the suspect's discarded cup, but the genetic profile remained the same. The biological evidence had effectively preserved a connection across time. The courtroom now had to examine what that connection meant. The prosecution would present the DNA as a major piece of evidence linking Talbot to Tanya. But the case was not based on DNA alone. Investigators also revisited the physical evidence surrounding the murder. Tanya had been sexually assaulted and shot. Jay had been beaten and strangled. A light blue blanket had been found wrapped around Jay's body, and investigators said neither victim's family recognized it. Tanya's 35mm Minolta camera was missing. Its lens was later recovered from a Portland pawn shop in 1990, while the camera body remained missing. These details had haunted the investigation because they suggested that objects connected to the victims had traveled beyond the immediate crime scenes. The locations themselves also mattered. According to investigators, Talbot had been living in the Woodinville area around the time of the murders, and his parents' residence was approximately 7 miles from where J.S. body was discovered. That geographical connection did not prove the murders by itself, but it became another piece of the prosecution's reconstruction. Investigators were trying to understand not only the biological connection, but also the physical landscape surrounding the crime. The man whose DNA had been recovered from evidence was now known. Where had he been in 1987? What connection did he have to the area? How could the evidence be interpreted in light of his known circumstances? Every question became part of the larger puzzle. The passage of time made the prosecution both extraordinary and difficult. 31 years can change almost everything about a person. A 24-year-old man can become a 55-year-old man. Neighborhoods change, buildings disappear, roads are rebuilt, people move, memories become less precise, witnesses die or become difficult to locate. Yet DNA has a peculiar relationship with time. If biological evidence is preserved properly, its genetic information can remain useful long after the people involved have aged. The DNA does not remember the crime, but it can preserve a biological connection that investigators can test decades later. That was exactly what happened here. The original investigators could not identify individual the later investigators could. The science had changed even though the evidence had not, but the defense still had an opportunity to challenge the state's interpretation. Genetic genealogy was relatively new, and the idea of using distant relatives to locate a murder suspect had generated intense interest. The defense could question the investigative process, the handling of evidence, the interpretation of the DNA, and the conclusions drawn from the broader circumstances. A jury could not simply be told that genealogy had produced a name. They had to understand how investigators moved from an unknown DNA profile to a family, and then from that family to Talbot. They also had to understand the significance of the direct DNA comparison from the discarded coffee cup. The genealogy was the investigative bridge. The direct comparison was the forensic confirmation. That distinction allowed prosecutors to explain why the case had progressed from a 31-year mystery to a specific defendant. For the families, however, the science could never be separated from the human cost. Jay was 20 years old. Tanya was 18. They had left home expecting to return the next day. Instead, their families spent decades living with the absence created by their deaths. Every birthday, every anniversary, every ordinary family event carried the knowledge that 2 young lives had been cut short. The passage of time did not make the murders disappear. It simply made the unanswered question older. Then the arrest arrived. Suddenly, the families were hearing a name: William Earl Talbot. The man investigators believed was individual A was no longer an invisible figure. He was sitting inside the legal system. The possibility of justice was no longer theoretical, but the trial also meant that the families had to hear the details of the murders again. A cold case can sometimes remain psychologically distant because it exists inside old files. A courtroom removes that distance. Evidence is read aloud. Photographs are discussed. Investigators explain what they found. Lawyers argue over what it means. The victims become present again through the testimony and records of the investigation. And for everyone involved, the central question becomes unavoidable. What happened during those final hours? The evidence could establish certain connections, but not every moment could be reconstructed. The last confirmed sighting of Jay and Tanya was the ferry ticket purchased in Bremerton. After that, investigators had to work with fragments. The bodies were found days later in separate locations. The van had been abandoned in Bellingham. Tanya's belongings were scattered. The camera remained missing except for its lens. A blanket appeared at Jay's body that his family did not recognize. The case was a landscape of unanswered questions. Yet the DNA provided something extraordinarily concrete. It connected Talbot to biological evidence from the investigation. That was the piece that had been missing since 1987. The prosecution could now place a human identity behind individual A. The man whose DNA had been preserved from the original case was sitting in court decades later. As the trial progressed, the jury was asked to consider evidence that had survived longer than many of the people who had originally investigated the crime. Detectives who had worked the case decades earlier had passed their knowledge to a new generation. Laboratory technology had evolved. Genealogy had become a forensic tool, and the evidence had traveled through all of it. The story was no longer simply about an unsolved murder. It had become a test of whether modern science could bring a decades-old investigation to a legal conclusion. That was the promise of genetic genealogy. It could open doors that traditional databases could not. But once the door opened, investigators still had to walk through it. They had to collect evidence. They had to identify the suspect. They had to establish the facts. They had to present the case in court. And ultimately, a jury had to decide whether the prosecution had proven its allegations beyond a reasonable doubt. The case of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg had survived because the evidence had survived. Now it would be judged under the highest standard of the criminal justice system. 31 years after two young people disappeared during what should have been an ordinary trip, their story was finally being heard in a courtroom. The old DNA profile had found its owner. The genealogy had found the family. The discarded coffee cup had provided the direct match. The arrest had brought the suspect before a judge. And now, every piece of evidence had to answer one final question. Was this the man responsible for the deaths of Jay and Tanya? The answer would soon belong to the jury. The courtroom had heard the evidence. It had heard the story of two young Canadians who left home in November 1987 and never returned. It had heard how their bodies were discovered days apart, how an unidentified male DNA profile survived inside the evidence for more than 3 decades, and how investigators eventually followed that genetic trail through a family tree until it led to William Earl Talbot. The question was no longer whether the case could be solved. It was whether the evidence was strong enough to establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The jury had to look backward across 31 years and decide whether the man sitting before them was responsible for the deaths of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg. It was an extraordinary task. The witnesses were speaking about events that had happened before some of them had even entered adulthood. The investigators had to explain decisions made decades earlier. Scientists had to explain DNA. Genealogists had to explain how distant relatives had helped identify a suspect. And prosecutors had to transform all of those complicated pieces into one coherent story. The central scientific evidence remained the same. DNA recovered during the original investigation matched Talbot. The genetic genealogy process had pointed investigators toward his family, and a discarded coffee cup had provided a direct comparison. The Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory confirmed the match. That evidence had been collected independently of Talbot's identification. It existed before investigators knew his name. That fact gave the prosecution a powerful foundation. The state was not asking the jury to believe that detectives had selected Talbot and then searched for something that would connect him to the crime. The opposite had happened. The DNA came first. The suspect came later. The evidence had effectively led investigators to the man, but the jury still had to understand the human story behind the science. Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg had left Victoria on November 18, 1987. Jay was 20. Tanya was 18. Their trip was supposed to be brief. They were traveling to Washington to obtain a furnace part for Jay's father. They took the ferry from Victoria to Port Angeles and continued south. Their last known movement came in Bremerton, where they purchased a ticket for the Seattle ferry at approximately 10:16 that night. After that, their lives disappeared into uncertainty. Their families searched. Posters were distributed. Investigators began looking for the couple. Then the discoveries came. Tanya's body was found on November 24th in a wooded area of Skagit County. J.S. van was located the next day in Bellingham, locked and abandoned. On November 26th, J.S. body was found in Snohomish County. The original investigation had therefore uncovered a disturbing chain stretching across several locations. The victims had disappeared together, but they were found separately. The van had been abandoned somewhere else. Their belongings were not all recovered. Some evidence pointed toward a violent encounter, while other clues remained unexplained. Among the most important was the biological evidence connected to Tanya. The male DNA profile recovered from that evidence became the genetic signature known as Individual A. For decades, that was all investigators had. The name was not a person's name. It was a placeholder for an unknown man, and that unknown man seemed destined to remain unidentified. Traditional DNA databases produced no match. There was no obvious suspect whose profile corresponded to the biological evidence. The case became a textbook example of a cold case trapped by the limitations of its era. Then science changed the rule. Genetic genealogy allowed investigators to search for relatives instead of searching only for the suspect himself. The unknown profile was uploaded to GEDmatch. Distant genetic connections emerged. Cease Moore began constructing family trees. The investigation moved backward through generations, following biological relationships until it eventually reached the Talbot family. That family tree became the bridge between an anonymous DNA profile and a living man. Detectives then conducted surveillance and obtained Talbot's discarded coffee cup. The DNA comparison provided the direct link. In May 2018, Talbot was arrested in Seattle. He was 55 years old. The man investigators had spent 31 years searching for was finally in custody, but his arrest did not automatically answer the larger questions. It did not reveal every detail of the murder. It did not explain the missing camera body. It did not explain the blanket found around Jay's body. It did not reveal exactly how Jay and Tanya had been separated. The prosecution had to build a case from the evidence that remained. The state's theory was that Talbot sexually assaulted Tanya and then killed her, and that Jay was also killed. The evidence presented at trial included the DNA connection as well as the physical circumstances surrounding the deaths. Prosecutors argued that the biological evidence was not an isolated coincidence. It was connected to a broader pattern of evidence from the original investigation. The defense challenged the state's case. The jury had to consider whether the prosecution had established Talbot's responsibility beyond a reasonable doubt. The process was particularly significant because the case represented a new era of forensic investigation. Genetic genealogy had been used to identify a suspect in a murder investigation, but now that identification was being tested inside a courtroom, the question was no longer whether the technique could generate a lead. It had already done that. The question was whether the entire chain of investigation could withstand legal scrutiny. And then came the moment the families had waited more than 3 decades to see. In 2019, a Snohomish County jury found William Earl Talbot guilty of 2 counts of aggravated first-degree murder for the deaths of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg. The verdict represented a dramatic transformation of the case. For 31 years, the murders had existed without a defendant. Now there was a conviction. The first jury conviction in the world resulting from forensic genetic genealogy had been reached in a case that began with 2 young people taking an ordinary trip across the border. The verdict carried an enormous emotional weight. Jay and Tanya had been 18 and 20 when they died. Their families had spent decades living with the absence of answers. Now, after more than 30 years, a jury had formally determined that Talbot was guilty of their murder. The cold case had become a conviction, but even then, the story was not finished. The court imposed the only possible sentence under Washington law for the aggravated first-degree murder convictions: life in prison without the possibility of parole. In July 2019, Judge Linda Cree sentenced Talbot to life without parole. For investigators, the sentence represented the culmination of a search that had crossed generations. Detectives who had worked the case in the 1980s could never have known that a future team would use genetic genealogy to identify their unknown suspect. The original evidence had survived long enough for technology to catch up with it. The case demonstrated something that had once seemed almost impossible. A murderer could leave behind a genetic signature in 1987, evade identification for 30 years, and still be found because relatives somewhere in the world had voluntarily contributed their DNA to a genealogy database. The killer did not have to submit his own DNA. He did not have to appear in a criminal database. He did not have to confess. His family tree could be enough to begin the search. That was the revolutionary part of the Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation. The DNA did not simply identify a person, it identified a network. The network pointed investigators toward a family. The family led them to Talbot. The direct DNA comparison then confirmed that the unknown profile belonged to him, but the conviction also demonstrated the importance of traditional investigative work. Genetic genealogy did not magically solve the case by itself. Investigators had to preserve the original evidence. Scientists had to develop and interpret the DNA profile. Genealogists had to construct the family tree. Detectives had to locate the suspect and obtain a direct sample. Prosecutors had to present the evidence. Jurors had to evaluate it. The final result was therefore not the product of one technology. It was the product of an investigative chain that stretched across decades. And for the families, perhaps the most important change was that the word unknown no longer stood between them and the case. There was now a name. There was now a conviction. There was now a sentence. The man investigators believed responsible had been held accountable by a jury. Yet even a conviction could not erase the reality of what had happened. Jay and Tanya were still gone. Their families could not reclaim the years lost without them. The verdict could establish responsibility, but it could not restore to young Liv. And there were still details that would remain forever uncertain. Exactly what happened during the final hours of the couple's journey could never be reconstructed perfectly. Some objects disappeared. Some memories were lost. Some questions had no surviving witness who could answer them. The courtroom could establish guilt, but it could not travel backward in time and recreate every moment. Then, unexpectedly, another chapter opened. Talbot appealed his conviction. The legal process continued long after the jury had delivered its verdict. In 2021, the Washington Court of Appeals reversed the convictions because of an issue involving a juror who should have been dismissed for cause. The decision did not declare Talbot innocent. It did not erase the DNA evidence. Instead, it determined that a constitutional error in jury selection required the convictions to be reversed. The case moved upward through the Washington court system. In 2022, the Washington Supreme Court addressed the juror issue and remanded the case for further consideration. The legal battle was no longer simply about the evidence from 1987. It was now about whether the original conviction had been obtained through a constitutionally valid process. That development created a stunning twist in a case that had already survived 31 years of uncertainty. The murder investigation had been solved. A jury had convicted Talbot. He had received life without parole, and yet the legal story was still unfolding. The case that began with a missing young couple had become a landmark forensic investigation and then a complicated appellate battle. Through all of it, the DNA remained at the center. The evidence that had waited silently for 30 years had not disappeared. It remained the foundation of the identification. The question now was how the courts would ultimately treat the conviction. And as the legal fight continued, one truth remained impossible to ignore. Jay Cook and Tanya Van Kalenborg had once been two young people taking a routine trip. Their disappearance had become one of the Pacific Northwest's most haunting cold cases. Their killer had remained unidentified for more than 3 decades. Then a genetic trail led investigators to a name, and a DNA match transformed that name into a defendant. A jury delivered a guilty verdict. A sentence followed, but the case had entered another uncertain chapter. The investigation had finally answered one question, but the justice system was now being forced to answer another. Could a conviction born from the most remarkable forensic breakthrough of its generation survive the scrutiny of the appellate court? The verdict had been delivered. William Earl Talbot. I had been found guilty of murdering Tanya Van Kalenborg and Jay Cook, and the sentence that followed was life in prison without the possibility of parole. After 31 years of uncertainty, it appeared that the long nightmare had finally reached its final page. But cold cases have a way of refusing to end quietly. Even after the jury spoke, the legal battle continued. Talbot appealed his convictions, and the case that had become a landmark in forensic genealogy suddenly entered another dangerous chapter. The evidence had survived 31 years. Now the conviction itself would have to survive the courts. The first trial had already demonstrated how extraordinary the investigation was. A DNA profile recovered in 1987 had remained unidentified for decades. Genetic genealogy had eventually connected that profile to relatives of the unknown man. Investigators followed the family tree toward William Earl Talbot II, obtained a discarded coffee cup, and confirmed the direct DNA match. The arrest followed in 2018. 2 years later, the courtroom had transformed that scientific breakthrough into a conviction, but the defense continued to challenge the result. Talbot's lawyers argued that the evidence did not establish beyond a reasonable doubt that he had committed the murders. They pointed to the distinction between proving that Talbot's DNA was present and proving that he was the person who killed Jay and Tanya. The argument was simple but powerful. DNA could establish contact, but the jury still had to determine what that contact meant. The prosecution had presented its theory that Talbot sexually assaulted Tanya and killed both victims. The defense argued that the evidence did not necessarily prove that the person whose DNA was found had committed the murders. The legal system now had to examine those arguments carefully. But another issue would eventually become even more important. During jury selection, one prospective juror had expressed concerns about whether she could remain impartial. She had personal experiences involving violence against women and indicated that she was uncertain about whether those experiences could affect her judgment. The defense challenged her for cause. The judge did not remove her. She ultimately served on the jury. The issue would later become the centerpiece of Talbot's appeal. In December 2021, the Washington Court of Appeals overturned his conviction, concluding that the juror should have been dismissed because of her expressed concerns about impartiality. For a moment, the case appeared to have been thrown back into uncertainty. The verdict that had seemed to close a 31-year investigation had been undone. The families who had waited decades for justice suddenly faced the possibility of another trial. The emotional impact was enormous. After all those years, they had finally heard the word guilty. Now that word had been taken away by an appellate decision. But the story did not end there. Washington prosecutors challenged the appellate ruling, taking the issue to the state's highest court. The question before the Washington Supreme Court was not whether the murders had happened. They had. It was not whether Talbot's DNA had been linked to the evidence. That connection remained central to the case. The question was whether the alleged juror bias required the conviction to be thrown out. The Supreme Court examined the circumstances surrounding jury selection and the choices made by the defense. The court ultimately reached a different conclusion from the lower appellate court. In December 2022, the Washington Supreme Court reinstated Talbot's conviction. The court determined that although the defense had challenged the juror for cause, defense attorneys still had peremptory challenges available and had chosen not to use one to remove that juror. The conviction therefore stood. The legal earthquake had passed. The guilty verdict returned. The life sentence remained. A case that had once appeared to be headed toward a new trial was pulled back from the edge. The decision was significant not only for Talbot, but for the future of forensic genetic genealogy. The case had already become a landmark because investigators had used genetic genealogy to identify the suspect. Now the conviction had survived appellate scrutiny. The evidence that had begun with an unknown DNA profile in 1987 had endured an investigation, an arrest, a trial, a conviction, an appeal, and another appeal. The genetic trail had not disappeared. The court had not erased it. The conviction remained intact. Yet the appellate proceedings revealed something important about the difference between solving a crime and securing a conviction. Investigators had solved the identity question in 2018. The jury had resolved the guilt question in 2019, but the courts had to determine whether the trial itself had been legally fair. Every stage required a different standard. A cold case can be solved scientifically and still become complicated legally. Evidence can be strong while procedural questions remain. A jury can deliver a verdict while an appellate court examines whether the process leading to that verdict was constitutional. The Talbot case demonstrated all of those tensions at once, and underneath the legal arguments remained the same to victims. Jay Cook and Tanya Van Kuylenborg had been 18 and 20 years old. Their families had spent decades waiting for someone to be held accountable. The conviction represented more than a legal document. It was the formal recognition that their deaths were not an unsolved mystery anymore. Someone had been identified. Someone had been tried. Someone had been convicted. The case had moved from uncertainty to accountability, but the years could never be restored. Tanya's family could not erase the decades without her. Jay's family could not return to the night before he left home. The verdict could not change the fact that 2 young lives had ended during what should have been a simple trip. What it could do was establish a legal conclusion about responsibility, and after the Supreme Court reinstated the convictions, that conclusion remained. Talbot remained in custody, serving life without parole. The case had survived its most dangerous legal challenge. The evidence that had once been invisible to investigators had now become the foundation of a conviction that had survived appellate review. But there was another remarkable layer to the story. During the original trial, investigators were still discovering the power of the evidence collected decades earlier. One of the most striking examples involved DNA recovered from a mixture associated with a zip tie found in the vein. At the time of the trial, forensic scientists had been able to examine the complex mixture more effectively using newer software. The analysis indicated that Talbot could be included as a possible contributor. The result was not initially presented to the jury because of the timing of the discovery and concerns about delaying the proceeding. The existence of additional forensic evidence illustrated something investigators had already learned. The case had been limited not by the absence of evidence, but by the ability of technology to interpret it. The evidence had been sitting there. The science had to catch up. That theme had defined the entire investigation. In 1987, detectives had collected biological evidence but could not identify its source. Decades later, genetic genealogy created a family tree. A discarded coffee cup provided a direct match. Then newer forensic software offered additional possibilities for analyzing complicated DNA mixtures. Every technological advance revealed another layer of information hidden inside the original evidence. It was almost as though the crime scene had been speaking all along, but investigators had been missing the language. The case therefore became a warning against assuming that an old investigation is finished simply because traditional methods have failed. A cold case can be dormant without being dead. Evidence can remain useful long after the original investigators have retired. Scientific methods can change. Databases can grow. Software can become more powerful. A clue dismissed as inconclusive in one decade can become decisive in another. Jay and Tanya's case demonstrated this in the most dramatic possible way. For 31 years, individual A was simply an unknown genetic profile. Then genetic genealogy transformed him from a biological mystery into a family connection. The family connection became William Earl Talbot. The direct DNA test confirmed the connection. The arrest followed. The trial followed. The conviction followed. And when that conviction was challenged, the state's highest court ultimately restored it. The legal system had moved through another layer of uncertainty and returned to the same conclusion: guilty life without parole. The case was no longer simply a cold case solved by DNA. It had become a landmark in the history of criminal investigation. It demonstrated that a murderer could remain unidentified for decades and still be located through relatives who had never met him, through DNA databases created for entirely different purposes, and through genealogical records that existed long before detectives ever knew the suspect's name. The technology was revolutionary, but the story remained deeply human. Somewhere behind every database entry was a family. Behind every forensic profile was a victim. Behind every legal argument were people who had spent decades waiting for answers. And behind the name William Earl Talbot, I was the unresolved question that had driven the investigation from the beginning. What exactly happened to Jay and Tanya during their final hours? The courts could establish guilt. DNA could establish a biological connection. Investigators could reconstruct movements and circumstances. But no technology could recover every lost moment. Some details would remain forever beyond reach. The final journey of the victims could be reconstructed only from fragments. Their last confirmed movements. The abandoned van. The separate locations where their bodies were discovered. The physical evidence. The DNA. The genealogy, the investigation, the trial, the verdict. Each piece told part of the story. None could return to the night itself, yet perhaps that was the most haunting aspect of all. For 31 years, the killer's identity had been hidden. Then, in a matter of months, the case moved from anonymity to arrest, from arrest to trial, from trial to conviction, from conviction to reversal, and finally back to conviction. The legal system had nearly reopened the entire nightmare before closing the door again. And when it did, the final picture was remarkably clear. The DNA that had survived since 1987 had led investigators to William Earl Talbot II. The jury had found him guilty. The sentence remained life without parole. The Washington Supreme Court had restored the conviction. The cold case had survived its final major legal challenge. Yet the case continued to echo far beyond one courtroom. It became a symbol of what modern forensic science could accomplish. It showed that a person could evade traditional identification for decades and still leave behind a biological trail that technology might someday follow. It showed investigators that old evidence should not automatically be considered useless. And it showed families waiting for answers that time does not necessarily destroy the possibility of justice. Sometimes the evidence simply has to wait. For Jay and Tanya, the wait had lasted 31 years. For their families, the consequences lasted a lifetime. And for investigators, the case became a reminder that the smallest surviving trace can sometimes outlive the person who left it behind. The killer may change his name, his appearance, his job, his address, even his entire life. But DNA does not change. A fingerprint does not forget. Evidence does not care how much time passes, and somewhere inside an old case file, the truth can remain exactly where investigators left it, waiting for the technology of another generation to finally uncover it. The conviction had survived the most serious legal challenge, but the story of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg was still far from simple. The murders had been solved through a forensic breakthrough that seemed almost impossible when the investigation began. Yet the deeper investigators looked, the more they realized that the case contained layers of evidence that had been waiting for decades to be understood. The DNA that identified William Earl Talbot was only the beginning. Other pieces of physical evidence, once inconclusive or impossible to interpret, could now be examined through modern forensic methods. The case had become a remarkable demonstration of what happens when old evidence meets new science. In 1987, investigators had collected biological material, clothing, objects, and other traces from multiple locations. They had worked with the technology available to them. They followed leads, they interviewed people, they searched for suspects. But the central biological profile did not match anyone in the law enforcement databases available at the time. The unknown man remained unidentified. For decades, that seemed to be the end of the story. It was not. The genetic genealogy breakthrough proved that the evidence had not been exhausted. It had simply reached the limits of what investigators could do with it at that moment. When the investigation was reopened with modern genetic tools, the old DNA suddenly became a roadmap. That road eventually led to Talbot. The direct DNA comparison from his discarded coffee cup confirmed the connection. The jury convicted him in 2019. The Washington Supreme Court later reinstated those convictions after an appellate challenge involving a juror, and in December 2023, the Court of Appeals on remand again affirmed the convictions while directing the trial court to strike an erroneous firearm enhancement from the judgment and sentence. But the legal process was only one part of the story. The physical evidence continued to reveal why this investigation had been so difficult from the beginning. And Tanya had not simply disappeared from one location. Their final journey had left a trail across Washington state. Tanya's body was found in Skagit County. Jaya's body was found in Snohomish County. Their van was abandoned in Bellingham. Those locations forced investigators to reconstruct a sequence that had never been witnessed from beginning to end. The couple had crossed into Washington together. They had traveled south. They had purchased their final known ferry ticket. Then, somewhere between those known moments, the path turned into violence. The van became one of the most important pieces of that mystery. It had been found locked and abandoned in a parking lot in Bellingham. Inside were traces of the couple's journey and evidence that investigators would continue examining for decades. Tanya's camera was missing. Her Minolta lens was eventually recovered from a pawn shop in Portland in 1990, but the camera body itself was never found. That missing object became another unanswered question. Where had the camera gone? Who had possessed it after the murders? Why had it been separated from the other belongings? Investigators could establish that the lens had traveled far from the original crime scene, but the camera body remained missing. The blanket found around J.S. body created another mystery. It was light blue, and his family did not recognize it. That meant investigators were looking at an object that apparently had not belonged to either victim. Where had it come from? Who had brought it to the location where Jay's body was found? Was it connected to the killer? Or was it simply an object whose significance could never be determined? Cold cases are filled with clues like that. An object can be undeniably real while its meaning remains uncertain. The investigator can preserve it, photograph it, record it, and place it inside an evidence file. But preservation does not guarantee interpretation. Sometimes the clue waits for another generation to ask a different question. That principle had already transformed the DNA investigation. It could potentially transform other evidence as well. One of the most important developments came from modern DNA analysis of complex evidence associated with the case. Investigators examined a DNA mixture associated with a zip tie found in the van. Advances in forensic software allowed scientists to analyze mixtures that would have been extremely difficult to interpret using older methods. The new analysis indicated that Talbot could be included as a possible contributor. The significance of that evidence was not that it suddenly created the case. Talbot had already been identified through the original biological evidence and genetic genealogy. Instead, it represented another example of technology revealing information that earlier investigators could not fully extract. The case was becoming a layered forensic record. One layer had been created in 1987. Another had been revealed through genetic genealogy in 2018. Another could be examined through modern interpretation of complex DNA mixtures. The evidence was accumulating not because investigators were creating new facts, but because science was becoming capable of reading old ones. That distinction is crucial. The murders themselves had not changed. The evidence had not been rewritten. What changed was the ability to understand it. And that is why cold cases can remain alive for decades. The physical evidence may be static, but forensic science is not. A sample that produced only a limited result decades ago can later produce a much stronger profile. A fingerprint that once could not be matched may become identifiable after databases expand. A DNA profile that once had nowhere to go may eventually connect to a relative in a genealogy database. A mixture once considered too complicated may become interpretable through new software. Time does not always destroy evidence. Sometimes it creates the opportunity for better science to arrive. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation became one of the clearest demonstrations of that principle. In 1987, investigators knew they had a biological clue. They simply could not identify its source. In 2018, genetic genealogy changed the direction of the search. Instead of looking for an unknown offender directly, investigators searched for people genetically related to him. The genealogy pointed toward the Talbot family. Detectives then used traditional investigative methods to obtain Talbot's discarded coffee cup. The laboratory confirmed the direct DNA match. Suddenly, 31 years of uncertainty collapsed into a specific identity. The arrest followed. The trial followed. The conviction followed. And then the appeal demonstrated another important truth. Solving a crime and proving a case in court are separate processes. Investigators can identify a suspect. Prosecutors must prove guilt. Defense attorneys can challenge evidence. Judges must ensure that constitutional rights are protected. Appellate courts must review whether legal errors affected the fairness of a trial. The Talbot case passed through all of those stages. The Washington Supreme Court rejected the defense's argument that the disputed juror required a new trial and the convictions remained in place. The legal outcome gave the families a level of certainty that had been impossible for most of their lives. But certainty did not mean that every mystery disappeared. There were still unanswered questions about the victim's final hours. There were still objects that had never been recovered. There were still details that no forensic test could reconstruct. The camera body was missing. The firearm connected to ballistic evidence was never recovered. The blanket's origin remained uncertain. The exact sequence of events between the ferry terminal and the discovery of the bodies could never be completely reconstructed. These gaps are what make the case so haunting. A murder investigation can establish responsibility without recovering every missing piece of the story. The law does not require investigators to know every second of a crime, but human curiosity is different. Families want to know what happened. They want to understand the final moments. They want to know where their loved ones were, what they saw, and what the killer did. Those questions can remain long after a conviction, and in the Cook and Van Cuylenborg case, the surviving evidence could answer some questions, but not all of them. The DNA could identify, it could connect. It could establish a biological relationship between a suspect and evidence. But DNA cannot describe a conversation. It cannot reveal an intention. It cannot reconstruct every movement inside a vehicle. It cannot explain why someone chose one location rather than another. It cannot bring the victims back. What it can do is preserve a fragment of truth. Sometimes that fragment is enough to reopen an investigation. Sometimes it is enough to identify a suspect. Sometimes it is enough to secure a conviction. In this case, it helped accomplish all three. And perhaps the most extraordinary part is that none of it was planned in 1987. Nobody investigating the murders could have known that decades later, genealogy databases would contain genetic information from distant relatives. Nobody could have known that a genealogist would build a family tree from those connections. Nobody could have known that detectives would follow the tree to a man living in Washington. Nobody could have known that a discarded coffee cup would provide the final direct comparison. The investigators were simply preserving evidence. The future supplied the technology. That is, the hidden architecture of many cold cases. The original investigators do not necessarily solve the case. They preserve the possibility of solving it. Their photographs, reports, samples, fingerprints, clothing, objects, and records become a bridge to another generation. Decades later, someone opens the file and asks a question the original investigators could not ask. Suddenly, the old evidence becomes new again. For Jay and Tanya, that process took more than 30 years. Their families endured the uncertainty through changing decades. Their names remained connected to an investigation that seemed to have no ending. Then one day, the unknown DNA profile had a family. The family had a branch. The branch had a name. The name had a DNA sample. And the DNA sample matched. It was not magic. It was persistence. It was science. It was investigators refusing to accept that an old case had to remain unsolved simply because the first generation of technology had failed. The final irony was that the killer's most important mistake may have been something he could never control. Biology. A tiny biological trace had survived. It remained inside evidence collected more than 3 decades earlier. It did not announce its owner's identity. It simply waited. And while the world changed around it, that genetic signature remained stable. 31 years passed, the victims remained gone. The families grew older. Investigators changed. Technology transformed, but the DNA remained. Then, eventually, someone learned how to listen to it. And when investigators finally did, the silence that had surrounded the case for decades began to disappear. The mystery was no longer a blank space. It was a chain of evidence leading toward one man. The conviction ultimately survived its appellate challenge. The forensic breakthrough remained intact, and the case entered history as one of the defining examples of genetic genealogy transforming a decades-old murder investigation. Yet beneath the scientific achievement was a much simpler truth. Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg were not just names in a landmark forensic case. They were two young people who expected to return home. They never did. For 31 years, the question of who had taken them remained unanswered. The answer eventually emerged from something microscopic, invisible, and extraordinarily persistent. Their killer could disappear into the passage of time. His DNA could not. The case of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg had already become extraordinary long before investigators discovered the name William Earl Talbot I. It was extraordinary because of the length of time involved, because of the age of the victims, because of the distance between the locations where their bodies were found, and because of the unanswered questions that remained after every conventional investigative avenue appeared to fail. But once genetic genealogy entered the investigation, the case became something much larger than a single murder investigation. It became a demonstration of how the future of forensic science could reach backward into the past and uncover an identity that had remained hidden for more than 3 decades. In 1987, investigators had a biological clue, but no name. 31 years later, they had both. The transformation was almost impossible to imagine when Jay and Tanya first disappeared. At that time, DNA testing was still in its early stages. Investigators could collect biological material, but the technology available to them could not produce the kind of investigative power that modern genetic genealogy would eventually provide. A crime scene could contain the truth, yet investigators might have no practical way to reach it. That was the problem facing detectives in the Cook and Van Cuylenborg case. The evidence existed. The identity did not. For years, investigators searched traditional databases for a match. Nothing happened. The unknown male profile remained exactly that, unknown. No name, no photograph, no address, no criminal record connected to the DNA, just a genetic signature attached to one of the most disturbing cold cases in Washington state. Then the investigation entered a new era. Genetic genealogy changed the question. Instead of asking, whose DNA is this? Investigators could ask, who is genetically related to the person whose DNA this is? That was a fundamentally different approach. The search no longer depended on the offender having previously entered a law enforcement database. It depended on relatives. If the unknown man had never been arrested, never submitted DNA to police, and never appeared in a criminal database, investigators could still potentially find him through his family tree. That possibility transformed the investigation. The unknown profile was uploaded to GEDmatch, a genealogy database that allowed investigators to search for genetic relationships. Distant matches appeared. Individually, those matches did not identify the murderer. They were pieces of a much larger puzzle, but genealogists could combine those genetic connections with traditional genealogical records, constructing family trees that extended backward through generations and then forward toward living descendants. Cease Moore and investigators with Parabon Nanolabs worked through that process. They followed the genetic relationships, examined family connections, and gradually narrowed the possibilities. The investigation eventually focused on the Talbot family, but even then, investigators had to be careful. A genealogical connection was not proof of guilt. It was an investigative lead. The family tree could point detectives toward a person, but the person still had to be tested. That distinction became crucial. Investigators eventually obtained a discarded coffee cup used by William Earl Talbot II. The sample was analyzed. The result was decisive. Talbot's DNA matched the unknown male profile recovered during the original investigation. The biological mystery that had lasted 31 years suddenly had an answer. The man investigators had called Individual A had a name: William Earl Talbot. The arrest followed in May 2018, but the significance of that moment went far beyond one suspect. For investigators around the country, the case demonstrated that an unidentified offender could potentially be located through relatives even when the offender himself had never been present in a law enforcement DNA database. The idea was revolutionary. The killer did not have to leave his own genetic information in a police system. Someone in his extended family might have provided enough information to begin constructing a path toward him. That possibility immediately changed the way detectives thought about unsolved murders. Cold cases had always depended on surviving evidence. Now investigators had another question to ask. What could modern genealogy do with the DNA that had already been preserved? The answer could be extraordinary. In the Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation, the breakthrough did not come because detectives discovered a new crime scene. It came because they revisited old evidence with new technology. The DNA had been there since 1987. The difference was that investigators now had tools capable of interpreting it in a completely different way. That is what made the case so powerful. It demonstrated that time does not always destroy a forensic clue. Sometimes time simply separates the evidence from the technology needed to understand it. Jay and Tanya's case had survived long enough for that technology to arrive. But there was another reason the case became so important. It forced investigators and courts to confront the difference between genetic identification and criminal proof. Finding a suspect through genealogy was one thing. Proving that suspect responsible for murder was another. Prosecutors had to present the DNA evidence alongside the circumstances of the killings and the other physical evidence collected during the original investigation. The jury ultimately convicted Talbot of the murder. The verdict demonstrated that genetic genealogy could move beyond investigative leads and become part of a criminal prosecution. That was a major turning point. Before this case, the concept of using genealogy to identify unknown homicide suspects was largely theoretical to the public. After the Talbot investigation, it became a method that law enforcement agencies across the United States began examining for their own unsolved cases. Detectives started looking at old evidence differently. A DNA profile that had produced no match in a traditional criminal database was no longer necessarily a dead end. It might contain a family tree. That family tree might contain a distant relative. That relative might eventually lead investigators to the person they had been searching for. The process could take time. It required specialized expertise. It required careful investigative work. And it raised significant privacy and ethical questions. But the potential was undeniable. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg case had demonstrated the power of the approach in one of the most dramatic ways imaginable. Still, the technology could not answer every question. Even after Talbot's identification and conviction, investigators could not reconstruct every minute of Jay and Tanya's final journey. They could establish important facts. They could establish where the bodies were found. They could establish the presence of biological evidence. They could establish the connection between Talbot's DNA and the unknown profile. But there were gaps that no database could fill. What exactly happened after Jay and Tanya's final confirmed movements? How did they become separated? What happened inside the van? Where did certain missing belongings go? Why was Tanya's camera body never recovered, even though the lens later surfaced in Oregon? What was the origin of the light blue blanket found with Jay? These questions remained part of the shadow surrounding the case. A conviction could answer who was responsible without providing a perfect reconstruction of every event. That distinction is often difficult for families. Legal justice and emotional closure are not the same thing. A verdict can establish guilt. It cannot restore a lost life. It cannot return a son or daughter to a family. It cannot erase 31 years of uncertainty. It can only provide a formal answer to a question that has remained open. For Jay's and Tanya's families, that answer carried enormous weight. They had spent decades knowing that someone had taken their loved ones away and that the person responsible had not been identified. Now there was a conviction. The name that had once been unknown was known. The biological evidence that had once been mysterious had been explained. The case that had once seemed destined to remain unsolved had entered the history books as a landmark forensic investigation. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of the case was the way the evidence had waited. Imagine the original investigators in 1987. They collect biological material. They document the scene. They preserve clothing and objects. They write reports. They search for suspects. They run the technology available to them. The profile produces no answer. Years pass. Detectives retire. New investigators inherit the file. The case becomes colder. Then, decades later, someone opens the evidence again. A new technique is applied. Suddenly, the old sample becomes a map. The map leads to relatives. The relatives led to a family. The family leads to one man, and the discarded coffee cup confirms what the genealogy suggested. That sequence is why the case became so influential. It showed that the most important breakthrough in a cold case may not come from a new clue. It may come from understanding an old clue differently. The evidence had not changed. The question had changed. In 1987, investigators wanted to know whether the DNA matched someone they already knew. In 2018, investigators asked whether the DNA could reveal someone they did not know. That subtle difference opened an entirely new investigative path. The case also changed public understanding of how forensic genealogy worked. Popular imagination can make the process seem instantaneous, as though investigators simply upload DNA and immediately receive a name. Reality is much more complicated. The genealogy process can involve distant genetic matches, extensive family trees, historical records, geographic research, elimination of unrelated branches, and conventional detective work. The final direct DNA comparison remains essential. The genealogy points toward a suspect. It does not replace forensic confirmation. That distinction became part of the legacy of the Cook and Van Cuylenborg case. It was not simply a story about a clever database search. It was a story about investigators combining old evidence, modern genetics, genealogy, laboratory science, surveillance, and traditional police work. Each piece had a role. None could have accomplished the entire investigation alone. And behind all of it was the evidence collected after two young people disappeared in Washington state in 1987. Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg had no way of knowing that their deaths would eventually become part of a revolution in forensic investigation. They could not have known that their case would help demonstrate the power of genetic genealogy to the world. They were simply two young people on a journey who expected to go home. Instead, their names became attached to one of the most important cold case breakthroughs of the modern era. Their story proved that an investigation does not necessarily end when the leads disappear. Sometimes it enters a different stage. Sometimes the file waits. Sometimes the evidence waits. And sometimes, after decades of silence, a technology that did not exist when the crime occurred finally gives that evidence a voice. For 31 years, the DNA profile connected to Tanya's murder had been silent. Then the family tree began to unfold. And with every generation traced, the distance between an unknown killer and a known suspect became small until finally there was nowhere left for the mystery to hide. For 31 years, investigators had a biological profile without a person. It was one of the most frustrating situations imaginable in a homicide investigation. The evidence was real. The DNA was real. The connection to the crime was real, but the identity behind it remained hidden. Every traditional database search that failed seemed to deepen the mystery. Every year that passed made the possibility of identifying the offender seem more remote. Then, almost overnight, the search changed direction. Investigators stopped looking for the killer himself and began looking for his relative. That decision would eventually lead them to William Earl Talbot, and transform the Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation into a landmark case in forensic genetic genealogy. The concept sounds simple when reduced to a sentence. In reality, it required a complicated chain of genetic analysis, genealogical research, investigative reasoning, and verification. The unknown DNA profile from 1987 did not simply produce a name. It produced clues about a family. Those clues had to be interpreted. The people who appeared in the genetic matches were not necessarily suspects. They could be distant relatives who had absolutely no connection to the murders. Their importance came from the family relationships they revealed. Each connection was another branch on a tree. Investigators and genealogists had to determine which branches were relevant and which led nowhere. The process required patience. A single genetic connection could point toward dozens or even hundreds of people. Researchers had to examine birth records, marriage records, obituaries, family histories, geographic locations, and relationships between generations. They had to determine how distant relatives connected to one another and how those connections could eventually lead to a living descendant who might share the unknown offender's DNA. The investigation was effectively moving backward through history to move forward toward a suspect. That was the strange logic of genetic genealogy. Instead of asking who the unknown man was directly, investigators asked who his ancestors might have been. From there, they traced descendants. The path eventually narrowed. A family line began to stand out. The Talbot family entered the picture. But investigators still had to be cautious. Genetic genealogy was a lead-generating tool. It could not substitute for direct forensic evidence. The fact that someone belonged to a family connected to the unknown DNA profile did not make that person a murderer. Investigators needed a direct comparison. That is why the discarded coffee cup became so important. Detectives identified William Earl Talbot I and obtained the cup he had used. It contained his biological material. Scientists compared that DNA with the profile recovered during the original investigation. The result was a direct match. The family tree had done its job. It had pointed investigators toward a person. Traditional forensic testing then confirmed that the person was the source of the unknown DNA profile. The mystery that had lasted 31 years had finally acquired a name. The significance of the breakthrough was enormous because it demonstrated the difference between an investigative lead and forensic confirmation. The genealogy had not convicted Talbot. It had not proved that he committed murder. It had given detectives a direction. The laboratory comparison provided the direct biological connection. Prosecutors could then present both stages of the process to the jury. The evidence had begun with the victims. It moved through the unknown profile. It traveled through distant relatives. It led to Talbot, and then it returned to the original evidence through a direct DNA match. The chain had closed, yet the genealogy investigation also raised a question that would become increasingly important in the years that followed. How much information can investigators obtain from DNA databases that were not originally created for law enforcement? The databases used in genealogy were designed to help people explore ancestry and family history. Participants generally uploaded their genetic information for genealogical purposes. The discovery that those same databases could help identify suspects in decades-old crimes created a new debate about privacy, consent, and the boundaries of forensic investigation. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg case became one of the earliest and most visible examples of that debate. The same technology that gave to families an answer also demonstrated how genetic information could connect people who had never volunteered to participate in a criminal investigation themselves. That tension would become one of the defining issues surrounding forensic genetic genealogy. But in the courtroom, the focus remained on Jay and Tanya. Their deaths had created the biological evidence that started the entire process. Without that evidence, there would have been no genetic profile to search. Without the profile, there would have been no genealogy. Without the genealogy, investigators might never have identified Talbot. The chain stretched from the crime scene in 1987 all the way to a database more than 30 years later. It was a chain created by chance, biology, preservation, and technology, and it began with two victims whose final journey had been ordinary until it suddenly was not. Jay and Tanya had been traveling together in Washington when their lives were interrupted by violence. Their bodies were discovered in different locations. Their van was abandoned. Their belongings were scattered. Their families were left with questions. Investigators spent years trying to answer them, but the unknown DNA profile remained the most powerful unresolved clue. It was almost as though the killer had left behind a signature without realizing it. The signature did not have a name, but it was unique enough to survive. The passage of time could not make it disappear. That is one of the most important principles of DNA evidence. Human memory fades. Physical objects deteriorate. Buildings change, roads are rebuilt, witnesses move away, but a properly preserved biological sample can remain useful for decades. In the Cook and Van Cuylenborg case, that biological evidence became the bridge between two eras of investigation. The first era began in 1987. Detectives worked with the tools available at the time. The second began more than 3 decades later. Investigators were able to use genetic genealogy and modern DNA technology. Between those two eras was an enormous gap, yet the evidence connected them perfectly. The first investigators did not know who they were preserving evidence for. They were simply doing their job. They could not have known that decades later, another team would open the file and find that the biological material still contained an answer. That is the quiet power of evidence preservation. Investigators sometimes work without knowing whether a clue will ever become useful. They preserve it because the possibility exists, and sometimes that possibility survives longer than anyone expects. The Talbot identification demonstrated exactly that. But once the suspect was identified, investigators still had to investigate the broader circumstances. They could not simply stop after the DNA match. They reviewed the old case files. They examined the locations. They revisited the physical evidence. They looked at the timeline. They compared the DNA evidence with other facts known about the murders. The goal was to determine whether the identification fit the overall investigation. The more they examined, the more the pieces formed a coherent picture. Talbot had been living in the region at the time of the murder. His DNA matched the biological evidence associated with Tanya. His connection to the case was not based on genealogy alone. It was supported by direct laboratory testing. The case therefore moved rapidly from identification to prosecution. In May 2018, Talbot was arrested. The public learned that the 31-year mystery had finally been cracked. News coverage described the investigation as a breakthrough in forensic genealogy. Researchers, police agencies, prosecutors, and journalists began examining what had happened. The case became an example of how technology could revive investigations that had seemed impossible to solve. But for the families, the scientific significance was secondary. They wanted the person responsible identified. They wanted the legal system to acknowledge what had happened. They wanted the uncertainty to end. The arrest was therefore a moment of enormous emotional significance, but it was not the same as closure. An arrest is an accusation. A conviction requires proof. The trial would have to establish whether the evidence justified a guilty verdict. The jury would hear how the unknown DNA profile had been recovered. They would hear how genetic genealogy had led investigators to the Talbot family. They would hear about the discarded coffee cup. They would hear about the direct DNA match. They would hear about the circumstances surrounding the murder, and then they would have to decide. The prosecution argued that the evidence connected Talbot to Tanya and to the murders. The defense challenged the interpretation of the evidence and the conclusions drawn from it. The jury ultimately found Talbot guilty. That verdict transformed the case from a forensic breakthrough into a legal judgment. The unknown man was no longer merely identified. He had been convicted. The case became one of the most significant examples of genetic genealogy leading to a murder conviction. Yet the significance extended beyond the courtroom. Police agencies across the country began looking at old cases differently. They began asking whether unidentified DNA profiles from decades old investigations could be used for genealogical research. Some departments established partnerships with forensic laboratories and genealogy specialists. Some created dedicated cold case programs. Some reopened cases that had been dormant for years. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation had shown what might be possible. A cold case did not necessarily require a new witness. It might require a new way of looking at evidence that had already been collected. That was the revolutionary idea. The future could solve the past, and the future had already arrived. But the same development that inspired investigators also created concerns. If a person's distant relative could help identify them in a criminal investigation, what did that mean for genetic privacy? Could people who had never participated in genealogy databases become indirectly identifiable? How should law enforcement use genetic information? What rules should govern the process? Those questions became part of the larger legacy of the case, yet none of those debates changed the basic reality that the genetic evidence had given Jay and Tanya's families something they had not had since 1987. an identified suspect. Their case had moved from an anonymous DNA profile to a family tree, from a family tree to a name, and from a name to a conviction. It was a journey that could not have been imagined when the victims first disappeared, and perhaps the most haunting part was how ordinary the beginning had been. Jay and Tanya were not setting out to become part of forensic history. They were simply traveling together. They expected to return home. Instead, they became the victims of a crime that would remain unsolved for 31 years. Their story would eventually help demonstrate that even when a killer disappears into the passage of time, his biological signature may remain. It can hide in a laboratory freezer. It can sit inside an evidence envelope. It can wait in a database. It can remain invisible to investigators for decades, but it does not forget its identity. It simply waits for someone to recognize what it means. And when investigators finally understood how to read the DNA left behind in 1987, the mystery that had haunted them for generations began to collapse. The unknown man had become a relative. The relative had become a suspect. The suspect had become a defendant, and the defendant had become a convicted murderer. 31 years of silence had been broken by a family tree. The most remarkable thing about the Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation was not simply that investigators eventually identified William Earl Talbot. It was that the evidence had remained capable of telling a story for more than 3 decades. In a case where memories had faded, witnesses had aged, locations had changed, and the